Jonathan Lemire officially deciding he's going to hang his American flag upside down because the Red Sox lost last night.
I did text that to you.
It was actually a neighbor that you have raised that you're doing it for. What?
Yeah, there are pictures taken. Yes, we will get to it later this morning. But the Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, American flag at his home hung upside down, signal of distress, done in the days after January 6th. It was a symbol of the Stop the Steal movement. It was hung at the Justice's house. He blames his wife.
You know, Willie, blaming the wife thing for people in public eye in trouble, that's going around.
Don't ever do that.
You know, I'm scared of you. I would never do that. But, Willie, this circles back to these people, and I will say these people, these Trumpers, who have spent their entire life attacking people for being insufficiently patriotic, and then they lose. And they just hate America. They hate America. They're constantly going around saying how weak we are. They hate our military. They say how weak our military is when it's the strongest in the world. They hate our economy. They claim the president of the United States is a socialist. The Dow yesterday made all of these people a lot richer, breaking 40,000 for the first time, despite Donald Trump's lies that it would collapse if Joe Biden was president of the United States. They hate this country. They attack this country. The only time they love it is when their person is in office. And I just got to say, and we've got a lot of legal, brilliant minds around this table. Yeah. So they can speak to this later if they want to. I will tell you, growing up, one of my friends' fathers was a federal judge. I had no idea until I got older whether he was Republican or Democrat. And that was the case in Northwest Florida, a very conservative place. The federal judges kept themselves beyond reproach. They never talked politics, ever, in the privacy of their homes. If you ask them opinion, they would just say, not my job, right? I'm a judge. They actually took their oath seriously. And for a Supreme Court justice, and I will say my opinion only, but the guy most likely to have had something to do with the leaking of the Dobbs decision. Yeah. Leaking it to the Wall Street Journal, or somebody connected to him leaking it to the Wall Street Journal because he wanted to keep Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett frozen in place. I think history will show that. But that aside, for a guy who is a Supreme Court justice that let that happen at his own home in one of the most fraught times in American history since the Civil War, it's just sad. And it shows how little respect he has for the institution. It shows how little respect he has for the law. It really does. It's disgusting. It's just disgusting.
Willie.
And by the way, we can't overstate the timing of this, which is January 17th, 2021. Think about where we were as a country, still completely shaken by what had happened on January 6th. And a sitting Supreme Court justice has a flag flying upside down at his home that is a symbol of solidarity, as John said, with the Stop the Steal movement. We should explain a little bit here. The New York Times is reporting that a photo of an American flag outside the home of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito has now been made public. The flag flown upside down. As the Times notes, the inverted flag has become a symbol of Trump supporters who claim, again, without evidence, that the 2020 election was stolen. Reading from the piece now, quote, the upside-down flag was aloft on January 17th, 2021, the images showed. President Donald J. Trump's supporters, including some brandishing the same symbol, had rioted at the Capitol a little over a week before. Mr. Biden's inauguration was 3 days away. Alarmed neighbors snapped photographs, some of which were recently obtained by the New York Times. While the flag was up, the court was still contending with whether to hear a 2020 election case, with Justice Alito on the losing end of that decision. In coming weeks, the justices will rule on two climactic cases involving the storming of the Capitol on January 6, including whether Mr. Trump has immunity for his actions. Their decisions will shape how accountable he can be held for trying to overturn the last presidential election and his chances for re-election in the upcoming one. I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag, Justice Alito said in an emailed statement to the Times. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs. Joe.
Wait. So you're going to hate on America because of something a neighbor did?
You're going to blame your wife?
Right. And blame your wife?
That excuse?
What is this? What is this?
My wife was mad at a neighbor.
Blaming wives. Anybody care to jump in here?
But I want to know what person, let alone woman, wife, would do that in response to a problem with a neighbor.
Eugene, a neighbor upsets me. Comes out, makes fun of me because the Rays beat the Red Sox last night, and the Red Sox really suck. Okay. And so I'm mad. Okay. I'm not going to hang my flag upside down. None of this. This is as dumb as what I heard about the Dobbs leak. Okay. Nobody believes him.
No, nobody believes him, and there's no reason to believe him. And he says briefly, you know, that Times story had neighbors suggesting that briefly meant for a period of days. This flag was flying upside down at Justice Alito's house, and the idea that, you know, a yard sign that says something rude, and apparently it said something rude about President Trump, is enough for a Supreme Court justice who was supposed to be non-political, was supposed to be, you know, less political than Caesar's wife, would do this, and I'll just say do this, not allow his wife to go out and run up the flagpole, but would do this, and now, of course, as Alito always does, try to sort of brazen his way through it. I mean, I'll just say it. I have thought for a long time that Alito is the worst justice. He is one of the worst justices that we have seen on the Supreme Court since the days of, you know, Roger Taney and the other justices that enabled decades of Jim Crow. I mean, he's his opinions have always struck me as intellectually dishonest, clearly tailored to come out to a predetermined result. He's, you know, and now this. It's just stunning to me. Stunning.
And it's not just that it was a few days after January 6th. While that flag was flying upside down, the court was still contending as to whether or not to hear a 2020 election case. And let's also remember, of course, Ginny Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, part of the same Stop the Steal movement. So now you have two justices potentially compromised on this issue as we head into another election that could very well end up before the court again.
Right, and Chuck, I really, ideology is irrelevant. Again, I've known progressive federal judges. I've known very conservative federal judges. They hold themselves beyond reproach. This is really, again, for the time, it's just unbelievable.
So something you said earlier, Joe, really resonated with me. You grew up in the Florida Panhandle, and a friend's father was a federal judge.
Right.
And you had no idea, none, what his politics were. So I spent my professional life in federal court around federal judges. I have never seen or heard anything that would suggest to me that ideology played a role in their decisions. Some of the judges were great, some were good, some were mediocre. So they got some stuff right, they got some stuff wrong, but I've never seen politics infect their work. And by the way, I can extend that a little bit further. It was true of the federal prosecutors with whom I worked. We never had a political discussion in 2 decades in our office. Ever. Same with the federal agents.
Chuck, I want you to underline that fact, because people have to understand that despite what they see from, I will just say this, from Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, people take their oaths seriously. Conservatives, moderates, progressives, they see themselves as officers of the court, and damn it, they held this country together after January the 6th.
And I have no doubt that among my colleagues were liberals, moderates, progressives, conservatives, all stripes. But we never discussed it. In fact, I remember once, Joe, walking through our office parking lot and seeing a bumper sticker on someone's car, which startled me because it was a political bumper sticker. I had never seen that ever before. It turned out that that particular federal prosecutor had borrowed his spouse's car because his was in the shop. And that was the only time I even saw a bumper sticker in our parking lot expressing a political view. It was so unusual that I noticed it.
Yeah.
With no less than the fate of our democracy at stake, the 9 justices of the United States Supreme Court hold in their hands the power to forever alter the trajectory of our country. How they rule on cases having to do with January 6th, the violent attempt to disrupt the peaceful transfer of presidential power, will echo for generations. So not only is it reasonable for us to expect those 9 human beings to go about their process impartially, it's also vital that they are seen and perceived as being impartial humans. The mere appearance of bias could strain our trust in an honest result for these cases, which is why today's news isn't just disturbing, it's scary. The New York Times cites photos and interviews with neighbors in reporting that in 2021, days before President Joe Biden's inauguration as president, days after the deadly attack on the United States Capitol of January 6, neighbors of conservative Justice Samuel Alito noticed something on his lawn, an upside-down American flag, a symbol commonly used in those days by Trump supporters who falsely suggested the election was stolen. A symbol of stop the steal, if you will. That flag flew in the Alito's yard, the front yard, as he and his fellow justices were contending with whether to hear a 2020 election case, an argument on which Alito would find himself on the losing end. In response to the New York Times seeking responses, Alito provided an emailed statement, quote, "I had no involvement whatsoever in the flying of the flag. It was briefly placed by, wait for it, Mrs. Alito, in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs." He blamed his wife. Sound familiar? Even if one accepts that at face value, we should ask ourselves, does it do anything to alleviate the perception of bias? That an anti-Trump lawn sign, a mean neighbor, was so personally insulting to Mrs. Alito that the only recourse they had as a Supreme Court justice and that justice's wife was to fly the Stop the Steal symbol, brandished by some January 6 rioters who attacked the Capitol 1 week before in a widely televised insurrection? Again, with not 1, but 2 January 6-related cases looming still, the first on presidential immunity, the other on the fate of a statute used to serve felony obstruction charges on hundreds who attacked the Capitol, the Supreme Court must now consider how far their new code of conduct goes, who it applies to, on the topic of disqualification. Quote, "A justice should disqualify himself or herself in a proceeding in which the justice's impartiality might reasonably be questioned. That is where an unbiased and reasonable person who is aware of all relevant circumstances would doubt that the justice could fairly discharge his or her duties." In response to the New York Times report, Senator Dick Durbin, the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, called on Alito to recuse himself from cases related to the insurrection and for the court to adopt a binding code of ethics. Another member of that committee, Senator Richard Blumenthal, who will be our guest in a few minutes, echoed that sentiment this morning on Morning Joe.
Justice Alito should not sit on any of these cases involving Donald Trump. He ought to recuse himself. And here's the challenge to Chief Justice Roberts. The United States Supreme Court's credibility is plummeting.
All-time low.
Completely.
Lower than perhaps even the United States Congress, and that's saying something. Mm-hmm. And it is due to the Supreme Court's own self-inflicted wounds. Alito and Thomas directly involved in the January 6th insurrection. Now they're going to sit on cases involving pivotal legal questions. Absolutely unthinkable.
And yet here we are. So how the Supreme Court will ultimately come down on the January 6 cases is unclear. Nobody knows. But even now, before the justices have made public their decisions, the American people have a legitimate reason to be concerned, to have doubt that the court will make a decision in an entirely impartial manner. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Senior editor for Slate and the host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick, is back. Plus, former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Heaphy, is back. With us at the table for the hour, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's here. Dahlia, this is a story that doesn't pack a lot of surprises when it comes to Alito and Thomas, a story that ProPublica won a Pulitzer for their extraordinary body of reporting, is a story that stopped me in my tracks last night when I saw the New York Times break this, and with the photo that has an image that, if you love this country, is like a body blow to see the image. And then after I saw the image, I read the story, and to learn that it flew over the house on the front lawn of one of 9 human beings who make up the United States Supreme Court is, to me, an epic scandal.
I mean, I think it's a scandal. I also think we're going to make a huge category error if we hyper-focus on the Sam Alito is a mean, bitter man who gets in fights with his neighbors, because I think it takes away from the institutional story that we have to focus on, that Senator Blumenthal focused on, which is how is it possible that there is a Supreme Court in which not one but 2 now justices have materially evinced positions in support of something that looks like Stop the Steal, something that looks like sympathy for the claim that the election was stolen, and that there is no mechanism whatsoever other than their own goodwill unto themselves to stop them. And I think that what's shocking about this story isn't so much that it kind of looks like the Alitos should have done what the rest of us do when we fight with our neighbors, which is like trim their rose bushes in the dark of night. But that's not the story. The story is that yet again, we have 2 justices who are sitting on cases, one already decided, Anderson, the Colorado case, 2 pending, as you said. And the only mechanism that the public has is to be angry and upset. That just can't be the end of the story.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Weissman, that he's a bad neighbor is the least shocking part of the story, right? And that a fight with a neighbor, that your instinct is to side with the insurrectionists, is the rot.
Yeah, so first, let's just leave aside the story. I mean, you don't have to be a former prosecutor to just pick that apart. And I would say, thank God there was a photo, because if there wasn't a photo, the story would be, it didn't happen. So there's a million ways that the cover story is absurd in the way that
Mrs. Alito did it?
Yeah, and it's just like the responses to the ProPublica stuff. I mean, the responses made you just think these are the people who are deciding to overturn Roe versus Wade. I want to go to Dahlia's point, because I think it's absolutely the right one. If you want to connect the image that you saw, you don't have to look far. If you look at what Alito said in the immunity argument, the argument was, should a president be subject to the criminal laws? And it was unbelievable. Somebody who was a U.S. attorney who is now sitting in the Supreme Court of the United States took the position, we cannot trust DOJ. We cannot trust a grand jury of citizens. We cannot trust the criminal justice system, which, by the way, he oversees the constitutional limits on what the government can do. We can't trust that, and that's why a president should be immune. And you tie that now to what you're seeing. This is a direct line in terms of what he espoused in the oral argument to the image that you are seeing. This is not like, oh, his wife just happened to be doing something, because you can tie it to his rhetoric and what his position is in the court.
Tim Heaphy, talk about this image. I mean, I saw it and immediately remembered it because I sat here and anchored hours of live television on January 6th, and I was staring at what the insurrectionists were carrying. A lot of them were carrying Trump flags, which is the first image that I had, but a lot of them carried this image of the flag upside down. There it is. I had to Google it on that day. I didn't know what that meant, but this is in the view of the insurrectionists. These are insurrectionists waving this flag. This was their symbol that day. This was the symbol Mrs. Alito, according to Justice Alito, if you even believe him at this point, decided to hang on her front lawn.
Right, Nicole, absolutely. It is one of the symbols that a lot of the rioters used to demonstrate their belief that the system was inverted, that the outcome was inverted, right? The symbolism here is that American ideals have been turned upside down, that the wrong person is being installed as president because all of this fraud has somehow gone undetected. Completely bogus, factually no foundation for that argument, but that's what the sort of symbol of the inverted flag means. And it was on display quite prominently at the Capitol on January 6th, which means there's no question that whoever made the decision to put that flag up in front of Justice Alito's house 11 days later was willingly associating with the insurrectionists, with this notion that the outcome was somehow inverted. To me, it doesn't matter who made the decision. It raises a very clear appearance issue, right? If a Supreme Court justice who is making decisions that bear directly upon the legality of what happened on January 6th, the solemnity of our democracy in the election, has evidence that that belief with that symbol, it, at the very least, raises an issue of appearance, of bias, of conflict, of impropriety. And that is why the rules not just say actual conflict, they say appearance of a conflict, which clearly calls for recusal.
Last night also brought the revelation about Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito and his upside-down American flag. According to photographic evidence obtained by the New York Times, the inverted flag, a symbol displayed by the Stop the Steal activists who insist the 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump. That flag was flying outside Justice Alito's home in January of 2021. It was flying there just days after the January 6th attack and while the Supreme Court was considering whether to hear an election case. The court ultimately decided not to take the case, but Sam Alito dissented. He would have taken the case while the Stop the Steal flag was flying in front of his house. To the New York Times, Alito blamed the whole thing on his wife, saying she had raised the upside-down flag in a dispute with a neighbor. Today, Justice Alito went to where else? Fox News, to elaborate further on this dispute, which apparently involved his wife being very upset about a neighbor's anti-Trump lawn sign.
He gave me a little more context, and he said there were some signs out that had vulgarity on them, and Mrs. Alito addressed that to the neighbor. They were on a walk through the neighborhood, and there were words between Mrs. Alito and the man in that house using vulgarity. Justice Alito told me this man used the C word with relation to his wife in front of him. And after that
he called it the C word in front of the judge or the justice?
That's what Justice Alito told me.
Really?
And said that at some point she was obviously very upset, went home, did the flag. He had nothing to do with it, didn't think it was a great idea, but it was there for a short time.
He's lucky that he only got the flag. He's lucky that the justice didn't pop him one in the eye.
He didn't think it was a great idea because it really, really wasn't. Joining me now to discuss this are Elie Mystal, justice correspondent for The Nation, and Mark Joseph Stern, senior writer covering the courts and the law for Slate Magazine. I know you guys have a lot of thoughts on this. Mark, you and Dahlia Lithwick share a byline today in Slate, and I just want to read an excerpt from your assessment of this scandal. The sheer pettiness of these gripes, you write, the fact that these men continue to filter justice through their small, round, grudge-colored glasses is what is breathtaking here. If being an unelected, lifetime-appointed, unbound by the rules jurist means anything at all, should it not mean that you perhaps rise above your grassy suburban neighborhood's feelings wars? Apparently not. Apparently, the life-altering principle of self-soothing your small injuries matters above all things. So, Mark, destroy the court and own the libs. Is that what's happening here?
That is Martha Ann Alito and Sam Alito's MO, as far as we can tell. And frankly, anyone who's been paying attention to Justice Alito's own behavior on the court probably should have seen this coming, including me. I mean, Justice Alito is a tragic and perfect example of what happens when someone's brain has been pickled in the brine of Fox News for years and years on end. He has gone from being a smart, sharp, somewhat partisan partisan conservative to being an all-out MAGA justice who clearly attempts to wield the law to benefit Donald Trump in every way possible and own the libs. And it's quite clear, I think, that he and his wife are as one on this. He and Martha Ann have always been close. She's been known to come to the courtroom for big hearings. She has very strong anti-abortion beliefs. Justice Alito himself attempted to intervene over and over again in 2020. You know, I think it's clear if he disagreed sincerely with his wife putting up a Stop the Steal flag, he would have stopped her or he would have taken it down. It's his house, too. The fact that he didn't shows just how low he's willing to go to express his beliefs. It's not enough to say it from the bench. It's not enough to spew it out in bile in his opinions. He has to put it in his neighbor's face. And when it winds up in the New York Times, he doesn't even deny it. He just makes up an excuse for why he had to do it because his neighbors were mean to them.
Yeah, I mean, Ellie, I'm just appalled at the fact that somehow anti-Trump rhetoric is seen as an attack on the Alitos. I mean, that in and of itself explains a value system that's at odds with what we think the justice system is, which is supposed to be impartial, no?
Yeah, look, what I feel really bad for what Alito says happened to him, but to me, as a black man that's on television from time to time, that sounds like Tuesday. All right, the level of hate and vitriol that he says that he felt is what I feel in my daily life every day, right? And you don't see me outside my house with like a Nazi flag because the neighbors were so mean to me today. Like that does not hold water. He put up the flag because he agrees with the message. And to make the point here, he didn't just agree with that message in 2021, right? He didn't just agree with that message 3 years ago. Right now, while this story is happening, and I don't see any vulgar signs in his face right now, he is in the process of letting Trump off for the very insurrection that Alito, we now know for a locked fact, supports, right? His immunity argument with Trump, first of all, he's already delayed it to the point where it's almost impossible to bring Trump to trial in any situation before the election. And we are waiting within the next few weeks to hear Sam Alito most likely dissenting from an opinion that would hold Trump accountable for crimes committed in connection with January 6th. So this flag thing, it's not a throwaway line. It's not like it is absolutely, it's petty and small and weak. But it's also, as you put it in your opening, Alex, deadly serious because he's using those grievances to let criminals go free so long as they're the criminals he agrees with.
Yeah, you bring up the immunity case, and that's actively being decided on by the court, Mark. Let's play a little bit of sound from Justice Alito during oral arguments on that case, raising a sort of paranoid grievance. This is what he had to say.
If an incumbent who loses a very close, hotly contested election knows that a real possibility after leaving office is not that the president is going to be able to go off into a peaceful retirement, but that the president may be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent, will that not lead us into a cycle that destabilizes the functioning of our country as a democracy?
I mean, it just sheds new light on that logic, doesn't it, Mark? He's not worried about Trump acting with impunity and being able to assassinate political rivals. He's worried about Trump being held accountable if he, I don't know, engages in election subversion.
Right. To Alito, the greatest threat to democracy is that the man who poses the single biggest peril to it might actually face a trial and a jury of his peers over it. You know, Alex, I was in the courtroom for that argument. It takes a lot to surprise me. I nearly fell out of my chair when Justice Alito made that statement. It was stunning to hear. And I just want to reiterate, I don't think that the Sam Alito of 10 or 15 years ago would have said something like that. You know, Alito used to be really good at kind of playing up some point of agreement with other conservatives so he could build a coalition. He was really good at asking questions that would get Justice Anthony Kennedy on his side, for instance, sometimes Chief Justice John Roberts. He's lost that ability, and now he seems to use oral arguments as this kind of airing of the grievances, this opportunity for him to speak out to the public and to his peers and to say, I'm disgusted by what President Trump is going through, in essence. and to put himself there like the congressman in front of the courthouse in New York City as a staunch defender of Donald Trump himself. And I'll just add, I think there's maybe a little silver lining here, which is that I do think he is repelling some of his conservative colleagues with this stuff. I think that justices like Amy Coney Barrett and even Brett Kavanaugh are starting to be really sort of discomforted, if not disturbed, by this behavior. And we're seeing it in some of these opinions, like the one that came out yesterday. You know, Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh joined this opinion that really kind of criticized harshly Justice Alito's dissent, said Justice Alito went about it the wrong way, used the wrong history, used the wrong methodology. It seems like they might be sending a message to him, buddy, you got to rein it in or we're not going to join your opinions. We won't be on your side.
Buddy, you got to stop flying the Stop the Steal flags in front of your house while you're taking up questions about January 6th. Ellie, you know, Alito is not the only one that has serious ethics complaints swirling around him. Clarence Thomas is the other. And I just kind of wonder whether you think the two embolden each other and whether, you know, what of John Roberts? Is there any hope that the Supreme Court and the leader of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice, decides to do anything about this?
Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas and John Roberts and all of the rest of them are emboldened by the complete feckless job Democrats in Congress have done to rein them in. All right? They're emboldened not by each other, but by Dick Durbin. Okay? The fact that we are still in 2024 and we do not have an ethics bill, not the ridiculousness that the Supreme Court said it was going to self-police when clearly they cannot police themselves. The fact that we do not have a congressional ethics bill with real teeth and real penalties for these people when they are revealed to be as corrupt as we all know them to be is a travesty. As long as, look, you never are going to get anything with the Republicans, Mike Johnson and Matt Gaetz and all the Trump cosplayers. They're all going to do their thing. But the fact that the Democrats cannot speak with one clear, coherent voice on what needs to be done in terms of this court, in terms of ethics, in terms of reform, in terms of limiting their power, not only in terms of limiting their lifetime power, but literally jurisdiction stripping and limiting what cases they can decide. The fact that the Democrats are nowhere on stopping these people is what emboldens these people. Alito acts the way he acts because he knows nothing is going to happen to him.
You talk about congressional Democrats, congressional Republicans are united on the cause of judicial ethics. They are worried about Judge Juan Merchan in New York. This is all happening in real time. This hypocrisy is unfolding before our very eyes. Elie Mystal and Mark Joseph Stern, thank you guys both for spending a little time this Friday night. I appreciate it.
When you venture out into the world, you may find yourself in a job or a community or a social setting where you will be pressured to endorse ideas you don't believe or to abandon core beliefs. It will be up to you to speak out.
That was Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito speaking earlier this month to graduates of Franciscan University of Steubenville, Ohio, one of the spiritual centers of the anti-abortion movement. The school consistently ranked as one of the most conservative colleges in America. Its website stresses time and time again how central the school has been in the long movement to criminalize abortion in America since Roe v. Wade. Little did we know then that Alito's family had already lived out his advice in their own Northern Virginia community right after the January 6th insurrection, as the Supreme Court was considering an election case, by flying the United States flag upside down on the front lawn of their house, a perversely anti-patriotic symbol adopted by Donald Trump's Stop the Steal supporters to protest Joe Biden's victory, an open nod to the insurrectionists. That's shocking behavior out of a sitting Supreme Court justice. It's all the more shocking because Alito didn't dispute what the inverted flag stood for. In an email statement to the New York Times, he just said it was his wife's idea to fly it to troll the libs in their neighborhood over their own yard signs. Almost sounds like Alito is saying he'd found himself in a social setting being pressured to endorse ideas he didn't believe. But then the news broke about some stock trades Alito made last summer. That August, there was that hokey performative right-wing effort to boycott Bud Light because the company had provided a single trans influencer with one can of beer. It's a little hard to remember just what a crazy cause celeb the Bud Light boycott became in the MAGA fever swamps, But here, let a heavily armed Kid Rock remind you.
Bud Light and Anheuser-Busch. Have a terrific day.
Now, while that boycott was raging last August, according to a search of financial records by legal reporter Chris Geidner, Justice Alito sold a chunk of stock in Bud Light's parent company, Anheuser-Busch, and he bought shares of Coors on the same day. Kid Rock was out shooting up Bud Light cases, and Sam Alito was selling his Anheuser-Busch stock. Now, you could say, well, I don't know, maybe just a coincidence. If it weren't for everything else we know about Sam Alito, the guy who just got an honorary degree, a standing ovation from a conservative Christian college for authoring the Dobbs decision that finally undid Roe v. Wade. A decision that curiously got leaked ahead of time, the full text of it, just like the Hobby Lobby decision, apparently, that he authored, that gave businesses the right to impose their religious beliefs on employees. In fact, the more you examine Alito's public comments, not just in his decisions, but in oral arguments before the court, like the immunity arguments a few weeks ago, in public speeches at conservative schools and organizations like the Federalist Society, the more he looks and sounds like what I think he is, a far-right, MAGA-loving extremist. There's millions of them in America. And nothing more explicitly confirms that than the fact that Alito and his wife apparently flew the symbol of an anti-democratic extremist movement over their own home.
Here's the New York Times headline from just a few hours ago. Another provocative flag was flown at another Alito home. Photographs obtained by the Times on 4 separate dates show that the Appeal to Heaven flag was flown over the New Jersey vacation home of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito in the summer of 2023. Michelle, what was your reaction when you saw this headline?
I mean, on the one hand, completely predictable, right? Justice Alito is exactly the person that a lot of us
fly one flag,
thought he was.
Fly another flag.
Right. And he is, I mean, my colleague Jamel Bowie wrote this column about how he's a true believer, right? He's not a Fox News producer. He's a Fox News watcher. He's, he has kind of very similar opinions, I think, to a lot of other crankish men in their 70s. He just happens to have lifetime unaccountable power over the Constitution of the United States and has been extremely contemptuous of any efforts to not just rein in that power, but to enact a code of ethics, on the Supreme Court. It's worth pointing out that the Supreme Court just under, pressure, just adopted a code of ethics that said that justices should recuse themselves. I don't know if I'm going to get the language exactly right, but I think when it can be reasonably inferred, yes, that when there might be reasonable doubts about their impartiality, something to that effect. How can anyone reasonably believe that Justice Alito is remotely capable of being impartial on around a cause that he cannot resist, that he feels so strongly about, that he cannot restrain himself from, flying banners over multiple properties?
Mark, Justice Alito's wife was blamed for the first flag incident. I thought it was very telling that the justice had nothing to say to the New York Times when asked for comment. What is your sort of immediate assessment of how damaging this is to the court?
Well, I think the justice was caught red-handed on this one, is not going to be able to shove off blame to his wife. My immediate reaction is that this is, of course, a terrible look for Alito, a terrible look for the Supreme Court, on the eve of yet another day when the justices will be handing down opinions. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m., we will be getting major opinions in cases that could involve things like abortion and gun control, and Alito may well be providing the deciding vote in some of those cases. And the nation will now know that the guy who tipped the scales one way or the other in some of those cases also flew a flag intimately associated with the insurrection at his beach house. But I just want to say, I feel like what's so damning here is that Justice Alito has clearly broken the sort of implicit contract that the Supreme Court makes with the United States of America and its citizenry. The Supreme Court justices are supposed to act with dignity and honor and impartiality, not just because they derive their legitimacy from all of that, from their black robes, the simple black robes that show they're just normal judges dispensing justice, but because when they go badly awry, we can't do anything about it. We can't vote them out of office. We can't recall them. There's virtually nothing that the American people can do about a justice who's gone as lawless and rogue as Sam Alito evidently has. And so it almost sort of, it can be compared to the British monarchy. You know, the reason that it still exists in its current form is because Queen Elizabeth was able to preserve this image of integrity and decency for so long, and the public respected it. Alito is shattering those efforts by the rest of the Supreme Court, or some of the rest of the Supreme Court. It's not going to lead to a good place for them because, again, that really is the only place they derive their power from. They don't have an army to enforce their decisions. When they lose respect, they lose authority.
Yeah, that's such a good point, Mark. I mean, it almost feels like he's doing it because he can, because he knows that there is no accountability.
Right.
It is owning the libs in the most spectacular fashion.
Right. I mean, it's like, who's going to stop me? I mean, I noticed that two of the things that Mark said, he talked about the implicit bargain that the Supreme Court has with the United States, but with the American people. But part of Trumpism has always been to disregard all of those implicit bargains, right? All of those norms. It's always been, who's going to stop me? And so, you know, Justice Alito clearly could care less about whether his exercise of power is seen as legitimate in the eyes of people who disagree with him. And I think that is where it ties in. You know, Justice Alito is a Catholic. The New Apostolic Reformation is a kind of species of Pentecostalism. But in as much as they see a kind of right to rule for certain citizens with certain beliefs and a kind of, you know, a lesser sort of citizenship for everyone else, I think it very much fits in with this. You know, who cares? It doesn't matter if you think I'm fair or just or my authority is well exercised. I have it, you don't.
Yeah, not even trying to cloak it in some other sort of broader notion of jurisprudence. Mark, you know, the assumption at this current hour is that not much can be done about this. We know that Chuck Schumer, I believe this was earlier today, before this New York Times story broke, suggested that, that he is discussing where to go from here with Senator Dick Durbin, who is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. But practically speaking, I mean, all roads lead to John Roberts. If anything is meaningful is actually going to be done, or do you think Congress can enact something? And I say that with an eye roll, not intentionally, but reflexively.
Well, I know some House Democrats are saying if they take back a majority that they will hold hearings on this, they will investigate. I think that is a positive step for anyone who wants accountability here. I think it's very unfortunate when senators on the Democratic side say, well, we won't really be doing anything about this because we don't have any meaningful options. They'll ignore our subpoenas. They'll laugh in our faces. That only feeds into this arrogance that Justice Alito is riding high on right now. This sense, as Michelle noted, that he is above everything and that he's able to flaunt it. It's in our faces. You know, Justice Alito is very cloistered. He does not have anyone in his circle to puncture this sense that he is above all public criticism and equal to Trump in the sense that no one can stop him because he has this sort of unlimited power. And I think that if Democrats don't even bother to try to puncture that sense of immunity that he has, if Democrats just give up and say, well, we tried a few subpoenas, they ignored them, so what can we do now? That's going to get Alito even further to the right. It's going to push him to new extremes, or at least allow him to reach those extremes within his bubble. And that is going to come out in his decisions. We are watching his decisions become increasingly unhinged. His questions from the bench are deranged at this point. His opinions are infused with radical Christian nationalism. If all Democrats can muster in a response to that is a shrug, then he will say, well, I guess no one really is going to stop me. And he will continue pulling the law in that very dark and dangerous direction.
I mean, so well said. And also, I mean, not the irony, the danger of a judge acting with impunity on the eve of potentially instilling in the next president, potentially Donald Trump, absolute immunity. I mean, the idea of a representative democracy appearing to dissolve before our very eyes. And, you know, Mark brings up and you bring up the infusion of Christian nationalism. When you look at what's happening in Congress, you look at what's happening in the legislative branch, vis-a-vis the Republican Party, you look what's happening in the judicial branch, 2 of the 3 branches of our government have become, you know, hotbeds of Christian fundamentalism.
Well, right. And I think that the same thing will follow the executive branch if Donald Trump is reelected, because, he already has plans to bring in a whole entourage of people. I mean, Donald Trump is, not a practicing Christian, although he might be a Christian nationalist in terms of his beliefs in kind of who should be privileged in our society. But he has plans to remake, or the people around him have plans to remake the entire executive branch. And this is just a kind of tiny example, a symbolic example of what that looks like. It's it's just completely unaccountable. Maybe we had norms and standards before, but, you and what army is going to enforce them?
Mark, this, in the context of the broader history of the court, this has been the project of the right wing since Ronald Reagan. And what is so astounding and to some degree appalling is the way in which it is in full flower, 40 years later, a dedicated effort to reverse social progress, dissolve the barrier between church and state, and see a right-wing takeover of the judiciary. It almost seems complete on a night like this.
Absolutely. And I think the great lesson that the Reagan administration imparted on some of its younger foot soldiers like Mitch McConnell, who are now leading the Republican Party, is if you capture the courts, you don't even have to win elections. Passing laws through democracy is really unwieldy. It takes forever. It's expensive. And those laws can be repealed. Those lawmakers can be voted out. But when a judge does it, well, if you can't get that overturned on appeal because the Supreme Court has been captured as well, that's just the law of the land. And it may stay that way for decades. This has indeed been the project, and it does feel on a night like tonight like the project has succeeded. But I'll say, for many decades, the conservative legal movement felt that they were failing. It took them nearly 50 years to overturn Roe. A lot of progressives might be dispirited today, but if they aren't playing the long game, then they really aren't playing to win at all.
Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. It has now been just over 24 hours since reporting by the New York Times revealed that a flag championed by the far-right Christian nationalist movement, a flag displayed widely by January 6 insurrectionists as they stormed the Capitol for Donald Trump, also flew all summer long last year over the beach house of Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. And of course, that news about that flag came just days after we learned that Alito's home in Virginia also displayed an upside-down American flag in the weeks after the violent sacking of the Capitol, another symbol adopted and embraced by Trump's Stop the Steal supporters. In that case, Alito responded to questions from the Times with an emailed statement saying his wife, the wife, hoisted that inverted flag in a dispute with their liberal neighbors. Why? He doesn't say. But in the days since news of this second right-wing flag broke, there has been no response from Alito, no response from the court or its Chief Justice John Roberts, who now faces a growing chorus of voices calling for him to appear before Congress and explain the conduct of the members of his court. That is in addition to calls for Alito, at a minimum, to recuse himself from two hugely consequential January 6-related cases sitting before the Supreme Court over his explicit and obvious violations of regulations on judicial conduct.
If Justice Alito does not recuse himself from the Trump immunity case and the Fisher January 6th case, he will do irreparable damage to the Supreme Court.
He definitively needs to recuse himself.
Well, of course, he should recuse himself from these cases.
At a very minimum, he has to recuse himself.
He should recuse himself from any Trump-related cases.
Now, all this is happening on a day when the Supreme Court was open for business, handing down decisions on cases it heard this spring. It was possible they might even announce some action on one of those cases that people say that Alito should recuse from, Donald Trump's claim that he is immune from prosecution for his attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Now, that's a case that the High Court has sat on for months. In fact, check this out. It has now been 164 days, nearly half a year, since special counsel Jack Smith asked the justices to weigh in immediately on Trump's immunity claims, saying basically, look, I know the Supreme Court's going to want to weigh on this, and the American voting public has a right to know the outcome of Trump's case before the 2024 election. And the court rejected that request, and they waited. And they are slow walking their decision now. So here we are now, nearly half a year later. It's harder and harder to think that someone like Sam Alito, whose household flew flags supporting the insurrection over not one but two of his houses, is in any way qualified to be a person who makes judgments on these cases. The court did not announce a ruling today in the immunity case. Who knows when and if they ever will. But the 6-3 conservative majority, the same conservative majority that destroyed abortion rights in Dobbs, the majority that now boasts multiple members who have flagrantly violated basic judicial ethics, covering everything from undeclared gifts to obvious conflicts of interest to open politicking, all of which apply to all the federal judges below the Supreme Court, that majority threw open the floodgates for Republican-led racial gerrymandering schemes. Court conservatives this time sided with a redistricting plan by South Carolina Republicans that pulled thousands of black voters out of a key battleground district. In a decision that was authored by Samuel Alito, the majority agreed with those Republicans. They weren't trying to disenfranchise voters of color. They were trying to disenfranchise Democrats, and whoopsie, most of them happen to be black. See how that works? It's a decision that will make it easier for Republicans to box out voters of color as long as they can argue their gerrymandering is based on political identity first and race second. A ruling that endangers the basic principle of one person, one vote. Another act of right-wing steamrolling that is the apotheosis of what the Trump era has wrought. We keep learning more daily about just how unaccountable they are. When a justice like Sam Alito flies this pro-insurrectionist flag, right-wing flag, not once but twice over his homes, the same flag flown by billionaire Republican donor Leonard Leo, who not only handpicked Trump's Supreme Court nominees, but also Alito and Thomas, and then proceeded to give both of them hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts, or at least facilitate those, and trips in recent years. They're all part of the same club. I'm just a judge. Supreme Court Justice Sam Alito didn't have to fly those flags to be a true conservative friend of the Trumpist agenda. This is what sticks with me, right? Think about this. I mean, Sam Alito is one of the most powerful reactionaries in the country, arguably the most. His court opinions, speeches, media appearances, he could just do that. Why did he fly the flags? He had to go an extra step and advertise. Take that flag in his vacation home, right? It's a signal from Alito about who he thinks he answers to. He knows he's not supposed to do that. He knows any other judge would get in trouble. You can't do that. But he thinks he answers to no one. We'll see if he's right. At the minimum, it suggests a disturbing readiness to keep pushing past any boundaries, as the movement that Alito is clearly a member of looks to destroy the current American constitutional order.
Well, the worst Supreme Court justices were not appointed by the worst president. Donald Trump's 3 Supreme Court justices have not yet proven themselves to be worse or more ethically challenged than the 2 who are now in an intense competition for the title of worst Supreme Court justice, Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito. They were each appointed 15 years apart by presidents from Connecticut who wanted you to believe they were from Texas. The Bushes were born in Connecticut, where the family had deep roots. The father of the first President Bush was Prescott Bush, a Republican senator from Connecticut. The Bush family preferred to go to college close to home, and so father and son presidents both went to Yale. They were what was then called country club Republicans, which simply meant they hated paying taxes. The first President Bush was a supporter of Planned Parenthood before he was selected to be Ronald Reagan's running mate in 1980, whereupon he had to suddenly pretend that he was opposed to any and all abortions. By the time George W. Bush was running for president, country club Republicans had been banished from the party and replaced by born-again Christians, which George W. Bush claimed to be. 1988 was one of those years when presidential campaign polls could not have been more wrong, giving Massachusetts Governor Michael Dukakis a 17-point lead in the summer over Vice President George H.W. Bush. We are suffering with the reign of Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court because George H.W. Bush won the presidential election in 1988, served only one term, and left only one legacy: Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas, who has clearly become the most publicly corrupt Supreme Court justice in history, taking massive amounts of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, to buy a motorhome, for example. Clarence Thomas has not paid income taxes on that money that has been handed to him by a billionaire who doesn't want Clarence Thomas to have to live on his salary as a Supreme Court justice and his wife's substantial income. Clarence Thomas may be a tax criminal. We don't know yet because he refuses to answer questions about the tax treatment of all the money that has been handed directly to him. But personal financial corruption, as egregious as it is, does not leave the mark on history that corruption of judicial scholarship leaves on the Supreme Court and the country and the lives of everyone living under laws written, some would say invented, by the Supreme Court. Which brings us to Samuel Alito, who was the product of a presidential election that was decided by the Republican majority on the Supreme Court. In the year 2000, when the Supreme Court decided to stop counting votes in Florida, their decision, they knew, gave the election to the Republican candidate George W. Bush over Vice President Al Gore. George W. Bush was the first candidate in history who did not get the most votes, but won the presidency. Al Gore got more votes than the person who won the Electoral College, or should I say, in this instance, was awarded the Electoral College by the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision. That was the first time in my life that I heard people who had spent their lives respecting the Supreme Court suddenly saying that the Supreme Court had become just another partisan institution. Many people, me included, tried to think of it as a single decision that was a close call, that looked partisan, but might not be. Time would tell if the Supreme Court had become another arm of Republican governance. Now, 24 years later, it's worse than anyone thought in 2000, after the Bush v. Gore decision. Samuel Alito was the first and only Supreme Court heckler during a State of the Union address. Samuel Alito disgraced himself and the Supreme Court when he decided he had something to say during the State of the Union by the first black president of the United States.
Last week, the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
There was Alito saying not true when President Obama was criticizing the court's disastrous decision on campaign finance. Samuel Alito was listening to a president who went to a better law school than he did and was a better law student. President Obama was the president of the Harvard Law Review when he was in law school. Was it a coincidence that the president was black? Would Alito have pulled his punk stunt against a white Democratic president? He hasn't done it again with Joe Biden, but then Samuel Alito hasn't shown up for a single State of the Union address since that time in 2010 when he decided to talk back to the President of the United States, when he decided to be the first and only Supreme Court justice to ever do that. The year before Samuel Alito did that, Republican House member Joe Wilson was the first heckler of a president in an address to a joint session of Congress. It was Congressman Wilson who famously yelled, "You lie," at President Obama. Congressman Wilson's voters in South Carolina, no doubt, loved that. And now heckling the president is something that Marjorie Taylor Greene and her friends think they're good at during State of the Union addresses. So think about that. First, a vile clown congressman yells, "You lie," to President Obama. And then, the next year, a Supreme Court justice says, "Not true," to President Obama during his State of the Union address. And now Republicans heckle the president during the State of the Union address, a dozen at a time. Samuel Alito is one of them. If he were a member of the House now, he'd be in the back benches with Marjorie Taylor Greene yelling at the president. He has given an explanation for why he was flying the American flag upside down that is obviously a lie. No sane person could believe it unless it is to be taken as an insanity defense by Justice Alito. When the New York Times reported that the Alito home had the American flag flying upside down after the January 6th attack on the Capitol, which happened right across the street from the Supreme Court, Justice Alito told this lie as his official explanation. I had no involvement whatsoever in flying the flag. It was briefly placed by Mrs. Alito in response to a neighbor's use of objectionable and personally insulting language on yard signs. Justice Alito did not have the decency to come up with a story that had minimal logic in it. Like his Supreme Court opinions, Alito did not care how preposterous that defense was. So a Supreme Court justice wants you to believe that his wife saw something in a neighbor's yard that made her run out to the flagpole, pull down the American flag, turn it upside down, and run the American flag back up the flagpole upside down as some kind of nonverbal insult payback to her neighbor. I refuse to believe that about Mrs. Alito, and I refuse to believe a Supreme Court justice's attempt to blame this on his wife. 2 full days have passed now since the second flag was found at the second Alito home, the Summer home in New Jersey. The second flag was one that was carried by the attackers of the Capitol on January 6th, just like the upside-down American flag was. This one is called an appeal to heaven flag. Justice Alito has not recused himself from 2 cases currently pending before the Supreme Court involving the attack on the Capitol on January 6th, including Donald Trump's possible complicity in that attack. He has, of course, an obligation to recuse himself because recusal is based on the appearance of bias, not the actual fact of bias. Appearance is enough. The fact doesn't have to be proved. It can simply be a reasonable suspicion of bias. Justice Alito's silence about the second flag only amplifies the suspicion every day. George W. Bush did this. Voters who didn't want the Supreme Court to take their rights away but decided there was no real difference between Al Gore and George W. Bush did this. Voters who did not show up to vote in 2000 because they didn't think anything was really at stake did this. We are living in the world created by the voters who, through neglect or their own choice, elected George W. Bush, and the voters who, through neglect or their own choice, elected Donald J. Trump. There is only one way for us to stop the control of our lives by the first president and his Supreme Court justices and the first President Bush and the second President Bush and Donald Trump and their Supreme Court justices, and that is to vote for a president who will not appoint people like Samuel Alito to the Supreme Court. There's only one person now, one person, standing between us and the next Samuel Alito. And that person is Joe Biden. Today, the Supreme Court issued a Samuel Alito decision, not surprisingly, rejecting a challenge to South Carolina's congressional redistricting map, a challenge brought by voters who said it was deliberately designed to reduce black participation and representation in the House of Representatives. Justice Elena Kagan, in her dissent of the Alito opinion, referred to Alito's, quote, upside-down application of the law. Justice Alito actually used the phrase upside down twice in her dissenting opinion, an obvious reference to Samuel Alito's upside down American flag and his upside down legal scholarship.
In a move he probably sees as brazen, but critics may see as foolish and short-sighted, conservative Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito today put himself over any and all concerns of his perceived lack of impartiality, informing lawmakers in 2 striking letters that he will not, I repeat, not recuse from cases involving the deadly January 6th insurrection. This despite calls to do so over the fact, not disputed, that his wife on 2 occasions flew flags at their 2 homes with symbols used by the January 6th insurrectionists on that day. Justice Alito fully and completely in black and white, blaming his wife for both those incidents, claiming this, quote, "As soon as I saw the upside-down American flag, I asked my wife to take it down. But for several days, she refused. My wife and I own our Virginia home jointly. She therefore has the legal right to use the property as she sees fit. And there were no additional steps that I could have taken to have the flag taken down more promptly." He adds that, quote, "My wife is fond of flying flags. I am not," end quote. What? What? Who says that about their wife or the upside-down insurrection flag? One of the 9 human beings on the Supreme Court, I guess. So the House Democrats are now responding, asking the Chief Justice John Roberts in a letter this afternoon how he plans to deal with this, how he plans to enforce the court's ethics code, because as they write, quote, "Adopting a code of ethics and failing to enforce it only serves to reinforce the perception that the Supreme Court justices operate without consequences for clearly unethical behavior." Joining our conversation, senior editor for Slate, host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick, is here, plus former RNC chair and co-host of MSNBC's The Weekend, Michael Steele, is here. Back at the table, former U.S. Attorney Harry Litman. Harry clerked for Supreme Court Justices Thurgood Marshall and Anthony Kennedy. Michael Steele, I got to start with you. What I want to say, I can't say even for my potty mouth broadcast here, but what is this? Who let's take the Supreme Court and the institution whose faith among the public has plunged farther and faster than any institution in civic life. Let's put a pin in that for a second. Who talks about their spouse like that?
Well, Nicole, we know who wears the flags in that family. That's for sure. It clearly ain't him. I think the brother needs to check how he's putting on his flags every morning. Look, that is some of the lamest sort of throwing the spouse under the bus. Yeah, I told her to take it down, but she refused to. Oh, you guys didn't have a conversation about this? You didn't impress upon her the symbolism of the upside down flag, irrespective of the current connotation of it in the context of January 6th. Before that, it is a symbol that the country's in distress. No one flies the flag upside down, especially if they get into an argument with a neighbor, because that was the whole premise of this. I saw a sign in the yard that said something terrible about Donald Trump. I got into an argument with a neighbor, then I go in the house and I fly my flag upside down. I just had an incident of road rage. What do? Come home and fly the flag upside down? Come on, stop it. You knew damn well what it was. You knew what it meant. You are aligned politically and ideologically with it. Because if you weren't, no matter, you would have gone and taken the flag down and just have your wife hit you upside the head with the flagpole later. But that's not what happened here. So stop stretching credulity and thinking that we're going to believe this crap coming out of your mouth about it when you know that's not true. We know it's not true. So, yeah, we know who wears the flags in that household.
And I guess, Dahlia, why I started here is because what Alito's doing substantively is saying, no, I will not recuse from January 6 cases. But what Alito is saying to us in his defensive crouch, which I don't know a lot about a lot of things, but I know a politically inspired defensive crouch where your hatred for the media that has the audacity to cover you as one of 9 human beings who sits on the United States Supreme Court is boiling out of you and sort of spilling out of you. What Alito is saying is, I can't have independence to make my own decisions on my own property, but trust me, I'll be independent on the Supreme Court. He is blowing out of the water any argument that he has the capacity to be neutral and unbiased in a decision by saying, I couldn't assert my independence in my own home.
Right. And it's almost more depressing than that. Look, I think, Michael makes the correct point, which is like with perfect immunity from consequences comes perfect silliness, right? This doesn't pass anyone's laugh test. It's like he didn't try. It's like he asked some kid on the street to write a defense and then said, good enough. There's no sense that this is meaningful or serious to him other than the grievance, which is, as you say, very meaningful, very serious. And I think the thing that is really fascinating to me is both that he throws his wife under the bus three times he's thrown his wife under the bus. I guess his wife likes flags. Ginny Thomas likes going to the ellipse on January 6th. Like, these wives are complicated feminists. But I think the most astounding part of this is that he asserts these boundless First Amendment rights for his wife, boundless property rights, right? She's the co-owner of the property. She's the sole owner of the beach house. And these boundless rights for her to have autonomy and dignity from the man who gave you Dobbs is almost gobsmacking, right? This is a man who doesn't think any American women have autonomy and dignity to regulate their own lives. But his wife, oh no, that's different. He can't stand up to her because her autonomy and dignity knows no bounds.
Harry, he's also the person whose conduct, personal and professional, to Dahlia's point, is most closely associated with the things that the public says sort of behind the tabs in the polls. I think we have Gallup and a second one that shows the court at its approval rating, the lowest since the question has been asked by pollsters. It's under 40% of Americans who have faith in the court. There you go. 61% of all Americans in the Marquette poll. And I believe that's a tick lower than where Gallup has it, but they haven't asked it recently, certainly not since the story has come out. So this one individual of 9 is most responsible for the decision. He authored the Dobbs decision that I think has 67 to 93% opposition from the public when asked in different ways in polls, as well as the ethics breaches. He's the guy who flew private because he said, well, if I didn't sit in it, the seat would have gone empty.
Yeah. It's an aggravating factor, and it's not just Dobbs, it's also the mischief that he seems to be making with immunity. He's done it several times. I think even leaving that aside, this is an extraordinarily grave breach. It's much more, I think, than sometimes we worry. There's the confounding factor of crazy spouses, but that's not what's going on here. And his explanation really misses the point. He knew, and it stayed up there. And this isn't like, well, what we worry when somebody's being supported financially, that might somehow influence their view on the substance. This is the view of the substance. This is screaming from his house, stop the steal. And it's not only the most burning issue of the day, it's an issue on which some people are telling the truth and other people it's fiction. There is no steal. So for him to embrace it in this way and now not understand that it's about his knowing it and portraying to the public, it's a joke that the public would say, oh, that's just that crazy Martha. Of course not. This is their homes, and this is screaming out what Alito's views are, and it stays for days. I think it's the most serious breach that we've seen because it goes directly to his views, his bias in the most important cases pending.
Well, that's incredibly profound. I mean, I hadn't heard it articulated that way. He's one of 9 people in the Supreme Court, and he can't clearly see the truth of the election of 2020.
Yeah. Right. It's again, it's not even like a pro-life flag. It's stop the steal. That's a flippant outrage.
Turning to the serious growing scandals surrounding Supreme Court Justice Alito, who's running from the flag flown over his own home, which was disloyal to the U.S. The New York Times reporting after the insurrection, as you may have now heard, Alito's home flew this upside-down American flag, echoing what rioters carried as they stormed the Capitol on Jan 6. It is affiliated with the people who say, stop the steal, a conspiracy theory about Trump's loss. It is wrong for an impartial judge to publicly agitate against the U.S. government at all, let alone by showing this direct sympathy or common cause with insurrectionists in that very time period. Doing so in those early days right after the attack is truly extreme. But Alito has repeatedly proven to be an extremist. That is a fact that also is negative for someone who is supposed to be an impartial judge. The Supreme Court is a government building. It follows the U.S. flag code. Alito's personal home violated that in a public display that others would obviously see. In the code section on respecting the flag, it mandates the flag should never be displayed upside down with the union down. That's strictly forbidden. Indeed, the code states the flag may only be flown upside down as a signal of dire distress in instances of extreme danger to life. That is one of the government rules that Alito's home violated. There are many problems with this, but that is just one of the very obvious, blunt violations. What he did through his home could not be done under the rules at the court where he works every day. But apparently, his home, whoever put the flag up and left it up, decided that echoing the January 6 criminals was more important than honoring the tradition that reserves that upside-down flag to a distress signal for Americans in danger. Again, this is one of several extreme actions, but it should not be normalized or minimized. And some in leadership are condemning it.
It's totally inappropriate. Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas are totally out of control. In the case of Samuel Alito, he definitively needs to recuse himself from any matter pending before the United States Supreme Court that has to do with the January 6th.
What Justice Alito is doing, in fact, is dragging down the credibility of the court, destroying American people's trust in the court by these kinds of flimsy excuses.
The fact that Justice Alito thinks that he can be the judge and jury of his own impartiality flies in the face of Supreme Court precedent.
Flies like an upside-down flag. Now, lawmakers requested a formal meeting with the Chief Justice to try to get some clarity or recusal rules going about Alito. We can tell you the Chief Justice has declined that request, and since Alito would be ruling on cases regarding Trump's role and convictions of people who stormed the Capitol after Alito's own home showed this kind of support for at least part of that movement, there are these questions about his impartiality, questions that can be reasonably raised, which is the standard the court's new non-binding ethics code proclaims. That was adopted, I should note, for the first time in history in response to Alito's other recent scandals, like secretly taking money through lavish gifts and special secret trips along with Justice Thomas. Alito is completely denying there's an issue and refusing to recuse. But before I get to that, let's keep in mind something important here. This is not a 1 or 2 day story. This is a rolling, ongoing ethics crisis for the court. And Alito knows the flag scandal is a bad part of it. He's not claiming he has some right to fly any flag as free speech. He's not trying to claim it meant something else or it was an accident. He knows that even on a court with no binding ethics rules for him, he can't just admit to something this bad for the reasons I showed you, that it's allied with the insurrectionists, that it violates the flag code, that it builds on the other scandals. So now Alito has been claiming that the flag atop his own home was something he wasn't involved with, that he could not control or impact, and that he did not know about. So in our special report right now, I want to get into that in detail because it matters. You could see the flag flying there. It's a normal large-size flag, hoisted in the air of his home. So when he says he didn't know it was flying, it sounds like a false defense because it's hard to see how it would be true. Alito recently writing to lawmakers that he had nothing whatsoever to do with flying of the flag, then strangely claiming he was not, quote, even aware of the upside-down flag until it was called to my attention. So let's be clear. Alito is claiming he did not even see the flag when entering his own home or leaving his home until it was called to his attention. He had to hear about it before he ever saw it. If that sounds like a dumb lie, it's because, from what we can tell, it's not true, and it's not believable. It's hard to imagine a criminal defense lawyer reviewing Alito's new public letter and telling the client to keep that in. You could imagine him saying, you want to claim you didn't see a flag at your own home for days when you came and went? Let's just leave that part out. Alito in this letter says he asked his wife to take it down, but for several days she refused. Alito blaming his wife for flying the flag and blaming her for resisting his request, as if he recognized the better course of action and she did not. Now, Alito has ruled against women's rights for decades. He now claims he was powerless to take this action against his own wife's wishes, and he falsely implies it would be somehow unlawful for him to take the flag down. He says, quote, "My wife and I own our home jointly. She has the legal right to use the property as she sees fit. There were no additional steps I could have taken to have the flag taken down more promptly," he writes. That is false. And this matters that he is making these kind of public claims in writing that are false. He says he had no other option, no additional step he could take. But the step would be Alito taking down the flag. Legally, one spouse's shared property interest doesn't automatically override the others on all property matters. Putting a flag up does not trump the other person taking it down. At best, it's a kind of draw, but this is not a legal property case. Alito's references read more like a distraction, spin, possibly less than the whole truth. His own letter still admits he saw the flag, and it stayed up that way. So even on his own weird defense, he's still part of the flag continuing to fly that way over his home. He admits that. And he claims the flag was itself hoisted that way, violating the U.S. flag code, etc., because of a response to a dispute that had already begun with his neighbors. His wife wanted to make a statement to them, but then reports came out that the dispute actually began weeks after the flag was raised, the New York Times corroborating that timeline with a recording from the neighbors that they had this dispute with, who made a call to the police, to the Alitos. Whatever the details of that, the timeline the New York Times has suggests Alito is lying about that. Again, we've always heard the cover-up can be worse than the crime, and that's true even for judges who deal with cover-ups and crimes all the time. Because, again, we talk about whether he is biased or not or impartial or not. He's clearly not thinking very independently or impartially about this issue. So Alito's running from the flag atop his home. He's making these implausible defenses. He didn't see it. He's allegedly providing a false timeline. If he knows it's false, as I'm saying very carefully, that would be lying. And that's not all. Alito, as you may recall, wrote the ruling ending 49 years of abortion rights in Roe. His draft opinion was also leaked in violation of court rules. There are still questions over whether a justice on the court leaked that, or if he could be that justice. Alito has been roundly criticized for using his power to curb women's rights in that very decision. So note in this new letter that he writes that his wife, quote, makes her own decisions, and I honor her right to do so. Okay, he honors her right. This woman's right, from the man who ended Roe. Is that deliberate doublespeak designed to upset his critics? Or is it embarrassingly, ignorantly delusional speak? Is it just someone who has no awareness of his own high-handed hypocrisy, specifically on these issues of women's rights and the word right? Well, Supreme Court expert Dahlia Lithwick, who we've interviewed many times, has studied this, and she argues the new letter from Alito, draws on a long line of his oppressive sexism in his work, in his job, in his power, and how he uses it, noting that he's quoted a 17th century witch sentencing judge who backed marital rape. Recall that when Alito served as a lower court judge, he voted to gut Roe by upholding a law that would have let husbands veto their wives' choices to have an abortion, she writes. Now he's granted his own wife the autonomy he's spent his career stripping from American women. He has emphatically granted her a right to privacy, rooted in a freedom to make individual choices that he has denied to the rest of the country. I'm reading at length because she makes some important points. She goes on to write, women unfortunate enough to lack powerful husbands don't get to play the privacy card when they feel their rights are under attack. Alito is gleeful when eroding the rights of every other woman in the country, yet deeply uneasy about encroaching on those of his own cherished bride. End quote. I want to be clear about this, especially as so many more cases head to the Supreme Court. Faced with serious ethical questions, Alito has not responded seriously. His letter is polemical, angry, contemptuous, full of spin more familiar to politicians than impartial judges. There is no legal requirement that he recuse, and there's no requirement that he write lawmakers back. By refusing to recuse but rushing to release this type of letter, he shows his priorities, including this apparent political sarcasm and political partisan posturing that appears to be designed specifically to inflame and disrespect. To use a word beneath the level of the Supreme Court, designed to troll like so many internet disputes. These are the words and actions of an unserious jurist, an example for judges to avoid. Do not act like this. Do not respond to fair and accountable questions like this. Do not diminish yourself and your work and the court on which you serve with these kind of cheap shots. Now, the Supreme Court is an old, slow institution. There are few quick fixes for these kind of problems. The court governs itself. Impeachments of justices have a very high bar. They've never had one removed. Congress could hypothetically enlarge the court. That would be legal, but that has its own dilemmas of partisan payback and warfare. Now, the current Senate Judiciary Chairman Durbin does have a proposed bill to strengthen the court's ethics code, which goes to these issues, require independent investigations of violations. I can tell you over 40% of the Senate actually co-sponsored it, but all Democrats, while Republicans are blocking a floor vote on that very bill, which would try to fix this. As for the facts, a more binding approach to ethics is clearly required because exactly of justices like Samuel Alito, trafficking in spin and apparent lies and potential corruption. He is not conducting himself impartially. He is not honoring or following even the new ethics code passed in part to deal with him. And what he is even saying when he chooses to weigh in is not believable. And at this point, Justice Alito may not even believe himself.
I not only complied with the ethical rules that are binding on federal judges, and they're very strict, but also that I did what I've tried to do throughout my career as a judge, and that is to go beyond the letter of the ethics rules and to avoid any situation where there might be an ethical question raised.
That's what he said on confirmation. That's not what he's doing. And led by this type of justice, this court will clearly not heal itself.
I mean, if you think of them as right-wing moles having to sit there festering at the Supreme Court, waiting until they had a big enough majority to do what they were sent to do, and then they finally have the great day when they can do it, and they can let the unlimited dark money flow, and they can take away abortion rights, and they can shut down the Voting Rights Act and do all these great things. And instead of getting cheers for it, they are criticized. They're thin-skinned and they're criticized. But it's almost like, you know, the cicadas have come out after years of just sitting there in the dark. Now they're showing who they really were all along, and there's a lot of resentment wrapped up in all of that.
Hi again, everyone. It's now 5 o'clock in New York. Another day, another reason to have profound and deep fear and doubt in Justice Samuel Alito's ability to be fair and impartial on the United States Supreme Court. That was Senator Whitehouse's theory of the case. We now have a new instance where Alito reveals himself. It has to do with new undercover audio recorded last week by a progressive activist named Lauren Windsor at the Supreme Court Historical Society's annual dinner, an event we told you about here before it happened. Windsor is known to coax candid comments out of Republican figures by misrepresenting herself as one of their allies. What you're about to hear is a portion of her recording. Windsor, playing the part of a religious conservative, speaks to Justice Samuel Alito about our nation's ideological tensions. Listen.
Know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
Spoiler alert, it's not like you can split the difference. Alito, in his own words, about whether or not the right and the left can ever, quote, live together or work together, quote, peacefully. This is a part in the program where we are obligated to tell you that as a network, we reached out to Justice Alito, as well as to press officers at the United States Supreme Court, to see if they wanted to respond to Justice Alito, in his own words, on tape, saying those things. You can't, quote, split the difference. We haven't received any comment yet. If we do, while we're on the air, we'll bring it to you right away. But again, another extraordinary development in the entire history of the United States Supreme Court. Justice Alito caught on tape is where we start the hour with some of our most favorite reporters and friends. Senior correspondent at Vox, author of The Agenda, How a Republican Supreme Court is Reshaping America, Ian Millhiser is back, plus senior editor for Slate and host of the Amicus podcast, Dahlia Lithwick is back. With me at the table, MSNBC legal analyst Christy Greenberg's here. Dahlia, it gives me no pleasure to say this, but if the country is educated, I say this as someone who spent my career in Republican politics, if the country is made aware of the extremism and radicalism of two of the members and families of the United States Supreme Court, 2 of 9 members, it will be thanks to liberal activists like Lauren Windsor and investigative journalists like those at ProPublica. What an extraordinary new piece of information and revealing comments, in his own words, on tape from Samuel Alito.
I think it's fair to say, and I know you didn't mean it this way, but I will accept the criticism that, you know, the Supreme Court dedicated press corps has a little bit been on screen save on this story for a very long time. We've known a lot of things were a little hinky, and I think most of us just felt like it was our job to report the cases and not the conduct. So, you know, thankfully, what surged into the void was, as you said, you know, Politico and ProPublica and the New York Times and now Lauren Windsor, who are saying, you know, the conduct is not just shocking and unconscionable and should be covered, but, and this is important, I think it's what Senator Whitehouse was getting at in the promo, it's intrinsically connected to the cases that we cover. It is intrinsically connected to the doctrine that they produce, because these are justices who in their private lives, day after day, show that they're in the tank for one side.
It was not intended as a criticism, more a celebration of I guess your analysis, though, is a little sharper than mine, Dahlia, so we'll go with it. We'll adopt it around here. I'm just so grateful. And listen, no one in this conversation has more culpability than me. I worked in the White House that appointed Samuel Alito. My theory, and it was why I was pressing Senator Whitehouse on this, my theory is that there's a chip on you know, Alito's shoulder the size of petite little Harriet Miers, because he was Bush's second choice afterward. But something else has happened. I mean, he's completely radicalized. He's not stupid, so that's not the right theory. He's an intelligent man who's so deep in a view that even in right-left politics, traditionally, it isn't represented on the main stage or the spectrum. I mean, just talk about his articulation of godliness.
I mean, in some sense, look, godliness, the sort of comment to Lauren Windsor is a sort of reflection of much larger themes that are not surprises to us. You can't read the Dobbs opinion and not know how he thinks about godliness. You can't read the text of the speech he gave in Rome right after Dobbs and not know how he thinks about godliness. And lest there were any remaining doubt, the flag, the Appeal to Heaven flag that flew for months at his beach house suggests exactly how he feels about godliness. So, you know, props to Lauren Windsor for getting it in his own mouth, but none of this is a surprise. And I just want to note, we have 2 major abortion cases that are pending that will come down in the next 3 weeks, in which at least one person has very, very, very strong feelings about godliness that will inflect on how that case gets decided.
I mean, 2 abortion cases. Yeah, Christy, and immunity. And I think if this is the other half of how we are to interpret the things he said during oral arguments, we should all buckle up.
We should absolutely buckle up. I mean, to me, this wasn't so shocking because following that oral argument on presidential immunity, Justice Alito's comments in particular were striking, because he talked about the fact that, you know, these prosecutors are going to come after, you know, the former president who should be resting in his retirement. And instead, you're going to have a bitter political opponent sending his prosecutor off, destabilizing democracy. I mean, it was wild. And, it was very clear where he was going. I think what we should absolutely do is buckle up for a very strong opinion here. But he was clearly forecasting that he is just in the tank for Trump, and he is going to write an opinion that gets to his desired result. I mean, when you hear those kinds of comments where he's talking about, the lack of compromise, and you don't need to compromise because one side has to win, and there are fundamental differences, and somebody's got to win. I mean, this is a far cry from what we heard back in confirmation hearings about judicial philosophy of textualism and originalism. That's what we used to hear. And now, this is what he really means. It's about winning, because he has a larger view, and that is godliness. And that is what is going to be, reflected in his actual opinions. Everything else was just window dressing for what he really thinks and believes. And I think that is incredibly troubling.
And what is it that we should be prepared for on immunity?
I mean, you wouldn't expect them to say absolute immunity because you would think that would be crazy. But then again, this is also crazy. Right. I've always thought that we will get a majority opinion, and maybe again Alito dissents because he is just that extreme, but some majority opinion that will have this kicked to Judge Chutkan and saying, oh well, there's some outer perimeter, there is some immunity for some acts, she has to go back and go through the facts, and again that accomplishes what they actually want to accomplish,
which is delay,
so that this doesn't happen before the election.
Ian, I didn't mean to put Dahlia on the spot. I appreciate how candid she was. I did the same thing in the last hour on the Trump story, and so I'll try to do it in the same way. Are we asking the wrong questions? I mean, and I'll take all of you out. Are we asking the wrong questions? I mean, is he too extreme to be on the Supreme Court? Is the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is controlled by Democrats, are they too convinced of their own lack of power and tools? I mean, what is happening where we're going like this? I mean, nobody thinks this is good, and nobody thinks there's anything that can be done.
Yeah, I mean, I think there has been an awakening amongst the American public to just how much of a problem the Supreme Court has become. I echo both of my colleagues who said this isn't a surprise. If you are shocked by the stuff that Alito said on this tape, wait till you read his opinion in Obergefell v. Hodges, his dissent, thankfully, where he said that one of the reasons why we can't extend equal marriage rights to gay couples is because if we did, then someone might call a conservative Christian a bigot. Wait till you read his opinion in Stormins v. Weissman, where he said that if you live in a town where the only pharmacist is a conservative Christian who doesn't like birth control, I guess you don't get to get your birth control because that person's rights trump yours. So, one thing that has been consistent in Alito's jurisprudence, that line that he had in the tape about how one side is going to win or the other side is going to win, is if there is the slightest inconvenience for his side, if someone might say a nasty word about his side, he has argued that that's a reason to take, fundamental rights away from other people. And I guess the reason why we're seeing so much attention on this, because Alito's been saying it in his opinions for so long, is after Dobbs and after so many outrages from the Supreme Court, the public is just really focused on the fact that, oh, wait, these guys are a problem.
Alito disrespected President Obama again during a 2010 State of the Union address after the president correctly criticized the Citizens United decision that kicked open the floodgates to billionaires like Leonard Leo and Alito and Clarence Thomas's benefactors to buy up politics and apparently our courts. Then there was that time, months after he penned the Dobbs decision overturning Roe, when Alito attended an event in Rome and complained about the rise in secularism. Unprompted, he went on to complain that world leaders dared to question his ruling.
I had the honor this term of writing, I think, the only Supreme Court decision in the history of that institution that has been lambasted by a whole string of foreign leaders who felt perfectly fine commenting on American law. One of these was former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, but he paid the price. All I am going to say is that ultimately, if we are going to win the battle to protect religious freedom in an increasingly secular society, we will need more than positive law.
He added that if religious liberty is protected, then men and women of faith will be able to speak out on social issues, which is exactly what he's been doing. And while he likes speaking up, he doesn't like being called out. Alito posted an unprecedented rebuke of ProPublica in the Rupert Murdoch-owned Wall Street Journal before ProPublica posted a stunning report that he had accepted a luxury fishing trip from Republican megadonor Paul Singer, who had active cases in front of the Supreme Court. And that's all before the upside-down flag, the upside-down American flag, I should note, and the Jesus at the insurrection flag flew at his homes. And also, that's just the stuff Sam Alito has been saying in public, which kind of makes you wonder what he's been saying behind closed doors. Well, there is blockbuster new audio today that gives us some insight into that. It comes from progressive activist and documentarian Lauren Windsor. Ms. Windsor, who is known for approaching high-profile conservative figures, pretending to be an ally, and then recording them making candid comments, spoke to Justice Alito at the Supreme Court Historical Society's annual dinner earlier this month, where she asked him about political polarization.
As a Catholic and as someone who really cherishes my faith, I don't know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. Really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
And that's what I'm saying. I think that the solution really is winning the moral argument. People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
And just to underscore how unusual that kind of response is from a Supreme Court justice, here is Chief Justice John Roberts after being asked a similar question by Ms. Windsor.
You don't think there's a role for the court in guiding us toward a more moral path?
No, I think the role for the court is deciding the cases. If I start, would you want me to be in charge of guiding us toward a more moral path? That's for the people we elect. That's not for lawyers.
Well, I guess I believe that the founders who are godly, we're Christians, and right. I think that we live in a Christian nation, and that our Supreme Court should be guiding us in that path.
Yeah, I don't know that we live in a Christian nation. I know a lot of Jewish and Muslim friends who would say maybe not. And it's not our job to do that. It's our job to decide the cases as best we can.
Joining me now is the creator and executive producer of The Undercurrent, Lauren Windsor, whose voice you just heard in those secret recordings. We should also note that Lauren attended this dinner as a dues-paying member of the society under her real name. Lauren, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joy.
Welcome back to the show. One side or the other is going to win. It's not like we can split the difference. These are shocking comments. But before I get to how you reacted, how you internally reacted to them, I do want to just underscore that. How did you get into this event?
I was a dues-paying member. I bought a ticket.
Were you surprised? Because there's another part of your recording where you say, hey, I talked to you in 2022. But Alito kept talking. He didn't seem he seemed undeterred by the fact that you're someone he doesn't know personally, and he was willing to say a lot to you.
Well, so it was 2023, and I included both of the interactions there just so people could see that, I think some of the criticism is, oh, well, he was just agreeing with you or whatnot. But look at his answer in 2023. It was different. It was, no, we don't have a role. I don't know. I don't know. And it was also contrasted to Robert's answer.
Let me play that. This is Justice Alito in 2023 also talking to you, Lauren Windsor, and talking about the media. Take a listen.
This was the last bastion of, I think, public trust. And how do we get back to that?
I wish I knew. I don't know. It's easy to blame the media, but I do blame them because they do nothing but criticize us. And so they have really eroded trust in the court. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, ordinary people, ordinary isn't the right word. American citizens in general need to work on this to try to heal this polarization because it's very dangerous. I do believe it's very dangerous.
So he had a very different answer back then. Were you surprised at how candid he was about saying one side or the other is going to win? It's not like we can split the difference. He's essentially saying, he's agreeing, yes, we need to win this culture war.
Yes, of course. I mean, when the first interaction happened, I was like, okay, well, it's very hard to get a judge, a justice, even lower level judges to talk about politics, anything that might imply politics, to give any sort of hint or signal as to what their own opinions may be. And so after that first interaction, I didn't publish it because it wasn't very newsworthy. Yeah. Interesting, but not newsworthy. But I felt like in the course of the last year, because that was before the spotlight was on him with ProPublica. Sure. So I felt like that grievance was more peaked over the past year with his own experience. And so I wanted to see if he had a different reaction.
And he certainly did. Let's talk about Martha Ann. Justice Alito has blamed Martha Ann, his wife, and said it is her flag. She's the one who flew them. It's her fault that there was an upside-down American flag and then a, consent to Jesus or embrace appeal to heaven flag outside their vacation home. Let me play for you, and this is new audio. It just recently went up on your social media and on Rolling Stone. Here is Martha Ann Alito, and you go up to her and you start by saying, hey, I'm a big fan of your husband, and let's hear what happens after that.
I'm a huge fan of your husband, and everything that you're going through, I just want to tell you that, like,
it's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
It's not okay, though. It's not okay.
It's okay. It's okay because if they come back to me, I'll get them. I'm going to be liberated, and I'm going to get them.
What do you mean by
Oh, well, there's a 5-year defamation statute of limitations.
But I don't know what you mean by gay, like yeah. Oh, okay.
Come on, I'll get you. Come on.
I'm normally not speechless. I'll get them. I'm going to get them. I'll be liberated, and I'm going to get them. She talks about a 5-year defamation statute of limitations. We know that there are conservative legal groups who would like to allow the media to be sued for defamation. Donald Trump talks about it all the time. Do you think that's what she was talking about?
Well, I certainly feel like, yeah, she would like to go after the media, but the implication here with a 5-year statute of limitations is that Justice Alito will be retired by then. And he would only retire
if there's a conservative.
If Trump were in the White House again. Sure. So there's an assumption there that Trump wins the White House. And so that adds an additional layer of self-interest to all of these decisions that he's deciding, because he's thinking about impending retirement.
Sure.
Amongst other things.
Yeah, I'm quite sure that the moment Donald Trump is inaugurated, they'll retire probably a day after that. There's another piece, and this one is even more bizarre, but I think also more relevant, since she is the one who Samuel Alito blamed for the various flags that flew both at their home and their vacation home. Here is Martha Ann Alito talking about flags. Take a listen.
You know what I want? I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month.
Exactly.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up, and I'm going to send them a message every day. Maybe every week I'll be changing the flags. There'll be all kinds. I made a flag in my head. This is how I satisfy myself. I made a flag. It's white, and it's yellow and orange flames around it, and in the middle is the word vergogna. Vergogna in Italian means shame.
Vergogna. For those of you who did not hear that clearly, I'm just going to reread this to you because I think you need to understand what she said. This is Mrs. Samuel Alito. You know what I want? I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month. Then she says, oh, please don't put up a flag. He's like, she means Samuel Alito, oh, please don't put up a flag. She said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up, and I'm going to send them a message every day. Maybe every week I'll be changing the flags. There'll be all kinds. I made a flag in my head. That's how I satisfy myself. I made a flag. It's white, and it has yellow and orange flames around it. And in the middle of it is the word vergogna. Vergogna. And she emphasized that as an Italian word that means shame. What were your immediate thoughts after hearing that?
Well, throughout this sort of rant, there was a lot of, just aggression and, against the media, getting even. And it felt like, another instance of getting even, shame. And at one point she talked about being German. And I really had more of the impression that she was Italian by the way that she was talking about
everything. From Begonia.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
And she said, "I'm German, and you just can't believe how much I can come at you and give more revenge." Begonia. Lauren Windsor, congratulations. This is a huge scoop, perhaps your biggest yet. Thank you for bringing it to the ReidOut. Much appreciated.
And in comments recorded by Lauren Windsor at the Supreme Court Historical Society's annual dinner earlier this month, Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito offered his assessment of the political and ideological struggle in America.
I don't know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. Really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
One side or the other is going to win. Now, heard in a vacuum by someone, those comments may not seem particularly striking. But remember, Samuel Alito is one of 9 justices on the Supreme Court, the highest court in our country. It is supposed to conduct itself with utmost fairness and impartiality in interpreting our Constitution and adjudicating the laws. And one of its justices, Samuel Alito, you just heard him, is telling a stranger at a crowded event that he believes that one political side is going to win, that there is no place for compromise. And for anyone who's followed Alito's time on the court, it's no secret which side the justice believes he is on. Look at just the past few weeks. I mean, Justice Alito has refused to recuse himself from a January 6th case and the Trump immunity case currently sitting before the court, even after reports that his homes displayed flags with right-wing political symbolism, including an upside-down American flag in the days after January 6th. Alito, who has built a reputation over the course of years as being tough on crime and generally unsympathetic to criminal defendants, also voiced a newfound empathy, is the only way to call it, for January 6th defendants of all people and Donald Trump during oral arguments in 2 cases. I mean, take, for example, the case of a January 6th defendant. Alito questions the Justice Department's use of an obstruction statute to prosecute people involved in the Capitol attack. He suggested, this was his argument, that if the court doesn't intervene, prosecutors could also seek to use it against people involved in peaceful demonstrations, like those that take place in a courtroom from time to time. Of course, we all know a peaceful protest is clearly not at all the same as people smashing windows and doors to invade the Capitol and causing members of Congress, and never mind the Republican Vice President of the United States, to flee for their lives. And in the face of multiple ethics scandals we've all been talking about involving undisclosed gifts from Republican mega donors to members of the Supreme Court, Alito has been unapologetic, telling the Wall Street Journal late last year that, quote, no provision in the Constitution gives Congress the authority to regulate the Supreme Court, period. Look, fairness and impartiality in both appearance and action are the principles that judges are supposed to follow, especially in the highest court of the land. And at least at some point, Samuel Alito knew that. Take a listen to an answer from his confirmation hearing back in 2006.
Do you believe that there is any room for a judge's own value or personal beliefs when he or she interprets the Constitution?
Judges have to be careful not to inject their own views into the interpretation of the Constitution, and for that matter, into the interpretation of statutes. That's not the job that we are given. That's not authority that we are given.
It's not the authority we are given. That's not the job we are given. I mean, Alito knows, or at least knew then, what his job entailed. And despite all of his actions and statements, he also apparently can't stand those who claim he's not living up to those standards. As he told the Wall Street Journal, quote, everyone is free to express disagreement with our decisions and to criticize our reasoning as they see fit. But saying or implying that the court is becoming an illegitimate institution or questioning our integrity crosses an important line. See, Justice Alito wants to be revered as an impartial judge who who, just calls balls and strikes as they're supposed to. But as this new tape and his time on the bench have shown, especially over the last several weeks and months, he's actually more of a player, actively engaged in one side's struggle to win. So he's given us every reason to expect this from him, given all these actions. That also doesn't mean it's something that we should or need to accept.
And this evening in Florida, Donald Trump's favorite federal judge, who he appointed, Aileen Mercedes Cannon, denied Donald Trump's request to dismiss the federal criminal case against him for violations of the Espionage Act and illegal possession of classified documents. Judge Cannon wrote that the charges in Special Prosecutor Jack Smith's indictment of Donald Trump are, quote, either permitted by law, raise evidentiary challenges not appropriate for disposition at this juncture, and or do not require dismissal, even if technically deficient, so long as the jury is instructed appropriately and presented with adequate verdict forms as to each defendant's alleged conduct. Judge Cannon did grant the Trump request to strike one paragraph of the indictment about Donald Trump's alleged meeting with a representative of his political action committee, believed to be his campaign advisor, Susie Wiles, at his golf club in Bedminster, New Jersey in 2021. The indictment says that Donald Trump showed that person a classified map at that time. Judge Cannon said that because showing that map is not one of the charged crimes in the indictment, it is, quote, not appropriate, her phrase, not appropriate, to include it in the indictment. And in the ongoing scandal that is the United States Supreme Court, now there are tapes, thanks to Lauren Windsor, who was interviewed by Joy Reid earlier this evening. Lauren Windsor is a progressive activist who is known to approach important Republican people, pretending to be an ally, making flattering comments, and then secretly recording their responses. She is a dues-paying member of the Supreme Court Historical Society, which has corrupted itself into an organization that allows right-wing Supreme Court influencers to comfortably influence right-wing Supreme Court justices at the annual dinner of that organization. Last year, at the Supreme Court Historical Society's annual dinner, Lauren Windsor made recordings of her chats with Supreme Court justices that even she found so uninteresting, she did not publish them. This year was different. She got Samuel Alito to agree on tape to the goal of returning the country to, quote, a place of godliness.
As a Catholic and as someone who really cherishes my faith, I don't know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of working, a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
And that's what I'm saying. I think that the solution really is winning the moral argument. People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
And by contrast, Chief Justice Roberts responded very differently.
But you don't think there's a role for the court in guiding us toward a more moral path?
No, I think the role for the court is deciding the cases. If I start, would you want me to be in charge of guiding us toward a more moral path? That's for the people we elect. That's not for lawyers.
Well, I guess I believe that the founders who are godly, we're Christians, and I think that we live in a Christian nation, and that our Supreme Court should be guiding us in that path.
Yeah, I don't know that we live in a Christian nation. I know a lot of Jewish and Muslim friends who would say maybe not. And it's not our job to do that. It's our job to decide the cases as best we can.
And since Samuel Alito made his wife very much a public figure by blaming her publicly for flying flags supportive of the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol at their homes, you might expect Mrs. Alito to have little to say to strangers about flags. And you would be wrong.
But why do you think they're coming after you?
They are.
I mean, like the whole like appeal to have heaven flag was like bull.
Right, but that's, you know, the other thing is the feminazis believe that he should control me.
Feminazi is a term coined by Rush Limbaugh, who died 3 years ago. Rush Limbaugh coined the term in the early 1990s when he was not just the center of right-wing media, he was the only real national right-wing media. Fox News had not even been invented yet. And so Samuel Alito's wife is quoting material from Rush Limbaugh that is over 30 years old. That's how long she's apparently been listening and taking direction from the likes of Rush Limbaugh.
You know what I want? I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month.
Exactly.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up and I'm going to send them a message every day. Maybe every week I'll be changing the flags. There'll be all kinds. I made a flag in my head. This is how I satisfy myself. I made a flag. It's white and it's yellow and orange flames around it. And in the middle is the word vergogna. Vergogna in Italian means shame.
Shame indeed. Joining us now is Andrew Weissmann, former FBI general counsel and former chief of the criminal division in the Eastern District of New York. He's an MSNBC legal analyst and co-author of the New York Times bestselling book, The Trump Indictments. Andrew, this is quite an interesting window of sound into the thinking of Samuel Alito and Chief Justice Roberts.
Well, the description from both of them couldn't be more striking in terms of where the country is. And, you know, we are hearing from a man who is a principal architect for the reversal after 50 years of Roe versus Wade. His thinking is, you know, in that decision is, I think, just as weak as his thinking that was shown in the letter he submitted trying to justify the flag incident. And you also have this dichotomy because you have the Chief Justice saying what is, of course, the correct thing to say. And we're on the eve of getting a decision on presidential immunity, and it is a real sort of blot on this country and the judicial system. I hate to be so direct that you have Justice Alito and Justice Thomas sitting on those decisions. That is not the way the country is supposed to be operated. It's not the way the court is supposed to be operating. And their conduct, as reflected on these tapes, but their conduct in many ways, even without these tapes, is something that is really besmirching, you know, a really important branch of government in this country that we are entitled to count on. And it's very hard to have faith in the system when you have that kind of conduct and these kinds of tape recordings coming out.
I'm Ari Melber, and while June can be a slower month in news, there is one ritual occurring every June, the final days of the Supreme Court term, where you see the running of the reporters. Maybe you've seen this scene before. The court, of course, it takes its own time, but the big and close cases often spark the most debates and rewrites. So they tend to come in these very last days of the term, typically in late June, where clerks and reporters and new reporters' assistants and interns all come sprinting out of the court, old school, with those key June rulings. In fact, it was late June 12 years ago when the Supreme Court upheld Obamacare on one of its last days in session. When the court first recognized marriage equality 9 years ago, It was a spontaneous group of people you see there who actually came out because you don't know which day the ruling was going to happen, and they filled their front area. That was late June, a monumental case on one of the last days of the term. Or maybe you remember where you were in that otherwise slow week when the court made history. That's our MSNBC coverage there. We were showing some of the same stuff you see in the other footage of at the time. Oh, and I was out there too, along with our team, covering history in the making, recognizing a new federal right, June 26, 2015. So what I'm telling you is every June, no matter who's on the court and which cases are pending, court news in this month of June is usually about the court, about its cases, its rulings, the last big cases coming down, and its work. But not this June. No. This June, as you may have noticed, the big news about this court is the rolling set of scandals. News that's more really about a few justices' mistakes off the bench than the court's actual work. The news is about hidden gifts and MAGA partisanship and rancor and misleading statements about breaking the U.S. flag code. It has been a combination of high-stakes failure and sometimes low-stakes pettiness, with Justices Thomas and Alito, as well as Alito's wife, a figure who is in these stories because he, Justice Alito, loudly blamed her for a flag incident that even he wanted to run from. So now you have these three figures front and center in June. Alito's home, as you may recall, broke the U.S. flag code, flying a flag upside down, and it was at the time of the insurrection. So it was using the same upside-down flag that the seditionists used at the Capitol. And Justice Alito issued this response that managed to blame his wife and engage in this apparently partisan sarcasm and make material misstatements that had been caught by fact-checkers, reporters, neighbors, and now his own wife. Now, the latest tension comes from these secret recordings you may have heard about that were made of the Alitos and others, and they build on the questions about corruption, bias, and partisanship amidst the lavish gifts that Justice Thomas has been taking, which puts more pressure on Chief Justice Roberts to enforce this new ethics code, which apparently isn't stopping these rolling scandals. So that's the whole context. As for the recordings, they're from a progressive activist who engages her suspects as if she is a conservative. So it's not a journalistic or transparent approach, but the answers are the verified responses of these individuals. So I've put this together. You may have heard about this. We've put it together in one sort of big collection, some of the tapes making news.
I don't know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end.
I think you're probably right. I think one side or the other is going to win. It's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised.
You know what I want? I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month.
Exactly. People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
Well, those are some of the answers. They suggest a bias right below or at the surface. That's different than what judges are supposed to express, and it's certainly different than how Chief Justice Roberts handled questions from that same activist.
I think the role for the court is deciding the cases. If I start, would you want me to be in charge of guiding us toward a more moral path? That's for the people we elect.
That's what he said to Miss Windsor, the activist. And she just joined our colleague Joy Reid last night discussing these tapes she made of the Alitos.
Throughout this sort of rant, there was a lot of, just aggression and, against the media, getting even.
So the quotes peel back layers on the court and offer a different explanation for Alito's rulings than his own claims to follow just historical meaning and not just push his own personal views. Now, I want to be clear. There are people who argue that judges are human beings, and if you were to do enough taping, you could find other judges sharing their views, whatever they may be, and the test is still how they rule, not what they think. But these tapes do bring also a whole second problem for Alito, who's facing multiple scandals. I mentioned the flags. The New York Times reporting that the Alito's home flew an upside-down American flag, echoing what seditionists waved at the Capitol during their crime spree, and they were waving this flag and hoisting it for days over their house at that time in January 21. Doing that alone violates the U.S. flag code, in the code section on respecting the flag, it mandates the flag should never be displayed upside down with the union down. Alito knew this was bad. He didn't defend it as just his free speech or some sort of, joke. Instead, he claimed it was all his wife's doing. And he claimed that he asked her to take it down and she refused. And he wrote down this defense to Congress saying, I asked my wife to take it down, but for several days she refused. And that he respected her rights, her choices. A line from the author of the ruling ending Roe v. Wade and the rights and choices for other women. So it struck many, him saying that he honors her right to make her own decisions, it struck many as an obviously partisan provocation. Like, no, you don't feel that way about other women, you haven't ruled that way. Now, in these same tapes, Justice Alito's wife says something very different. She says she deferred to him, seeming to complicate this story.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up, and I'm going to send them a message every day. Maybe every week I'll be changing the flags. There'll be all kinds. I made a flag in my head. This is how I satisfy myself. I made a flag. It's white, and it's yellow and orange flames around it. And in the middle is the word vergogna. Vergogna in Italian means shame.
Ms. Alito can wave or talk about whatever flag she wants. But she is saying here that she defers to him. And he says she doesn't on the same flag issue. So an otherwise kind of bizarre MAGA partisan neighborhood spat is now raising other questions, especially since she was speaking to what she thought was a like-minded individual, seeming to speak freely and privately. In other words, there's no reason to think what's on tape there is somehow part of some grand conspiracy theory. It seems the more direct interpretation is she's saying what happened and he wasn't truthful. So the questions that are raised would be, was Justice Alito lying? Did he coordinate or change his story after the fact with his wife? Do they have one story for the public that's false and a true story in private? If he was lying, did he intentionally write that lie in an official letter to Congress and intend to submit it as a false statement to Congress? That would be a grave matter for any judge. And we should mention, in some rare cases, false statements to Congress are investigated, even prosecuted, though I should say not typically when you have relations between the judicial and legislative branch. Another question is, what is Chief Justice John Roberts doing about any of this? The Chief Justice already refused a proposal to just meet with top senators about these substantive issues with Alito. But it's clear this isn't going away. Not for Alito, not for the court, and not for Justice Roberts. Indeed, the news now tonight is that Senate Democrats are eyeing other ways to link Supreme Court funding with a mandate that the court adopt an enforceable ethics code. And that approach could provide a path for the Senate to get the court to clean up its act without having to pass a whole new law. We were reporting last week about how Senator Durbin has a bill along those same lines about a mandated ethics process, but that would have to get through Congress and defeat a filibuster and get through the Republican House. So this might be a different way. Now, June is usually a time to be discussing the court rulings, the running of the rulings out in front of the court. And we are awaiting some big ones on insurrection convictions and how to put a former president on trial for stopping the peaceful transfer of power. And honestly, Washington and news viewers, legal commentators, this sort of community of people who care about this stuff would normally be focused on the substance of that. But a small number of judges have repeatedly undercut the court's credibility on those pending cases. And Alito angrily refusing to recuse on either the January 6th case or the other one, despite his home's public solidarity with the insurrectionist sign and his apparent cover-up or misleading statement after the fact, submitted, by the way, to the government. Same for Justice Thomas, who won't recuse, even though his wife personally engaged with people from the Stop the Steal movement, and she lobbied for its outcomes. And Thomas has a separate scandal of his own habit of secretly pocketing millions of dollars in gifts, conduct that would get any member of Congress in trouble. You can see there he has also taken in a lot more money than everybody else over the years. But this is apparently fine on John Roberts' court. So here we are. people with tenure and unreviewable power, whose only job is to exercise judgment and to take the great privilege of their lifetime employment and tenure and benefits and security and all the things they get in those jobs and just be independent and use good judgment. And they're proving they lack it when it comes to how they enrich themselves with gifts that dwarf most people's salaries and their public embrace of anti-American insignia amidst violence and their own sloppy cover-up and misdirection about these flag fights and neighborhood disputes. And yes, I should note, since we're trying to do the facts, part of the facts here start with a fairly silly, baroque, at times petty political fight in the Alito's neighborhood. To paraphrase Drake, the petty is real. Very real.
Like I said, exclusive, never-before-heard audio recordings of Justice Samuel Alito speaking to an undercover progressive activist. That's what we have tonight. That is in addition to the bombshell recordings that were released yesterday, and you will definitely want to hear these recordings when we play them. If you've been wondering how those secret tapes were made in the very first place, how activists and judges on the highest court in this land, how they came to mingle behind closed doors, well, the answer to that begins almost 10 years ago to this day, when the Supreme Court handed down a major decision.
Supporters of the Hobby Lobby cheered today's victory. The Oklahoma family that owns the chain of 500 craft stores claimed that providing insurance coverage for some forms of contraceptives under Obamacare would be the equivalent of paying for abortion. The court's dissenters called the ruling startling and said it will allow companies to opt out of any law they judge incompatible with their sincerely held religious beliefs.
The Hobby Lobby decision. The majority opinion in Burwell v. Hobby Lobby was written by Justice Samuel Alito, and it was one of the first signs that conservatives on this court were willing to go after reproductive freedoms, no matter the consequence. Now, in the wake of the Dobbs decision 10 years later, Hobby Lobby seems sort of like the canary in the coal mine in more ways than one. In November of 2022, the New York Times offered key reporting about how the Hobby Lobby decision came to be. For years before the court heard the case, conservative Christians had been engaged in a campaign called Operation Higher Court. That operation was to personally court and influence the Supreme Court's conservative justices. And that effort was spearheaded by a man named Reverend Robert Schenck, who would recruit Christian couples, whom he called stealth missionaries, to gain access to the judges and to impress upon them the importance of conservative Christian values. Here's how the New York Times described one of their strategies. Reverend Schenck gave his stealth missionaries close instruction. The justices were more likely to let their guard down at the Supreme Court Historical Society annual dinners because they assumed attendees had been properly vetted. See a justice? Boldly approach, Schenck told the couples, according to a briefing document reviewed by the Times. If given the opportunity, bear witness to biblical truth, but don't push it, he said. Your presence alone at the Historical Society events telegraphs a very important signal to the justices. Christians are concerned about the court and the issues that come before it. That strategy appears to have paid off. According to the Times reporting, some of Schenck's stealth missionaries were able to build enough of a relationship with Justice Alito and his wife, Martha Ann, that they obtained advance notice of the court's Hobby Lobby decision before it came out. That breach, that unprecedented breach, foreshadowed the leaked Dobbs decision, striking down Roe 8 years later. And that specific strategy of using the Supreme Court's annual Historical Society dinners as a way to gain access to Supreme Court justices, well, it turns out that, too, is relevant again just this week. The Historical Society dinner is a yearly event where wealthy donors give money to a nonprofit dedicated to preserving the court's history. And in exchange for their money, those donors get to rub shoulders with some of the justices and their spouses. As it turns out, conservatives weren't the only ones in on this tidy little arrangement. Last week, progressive activist Lauren Windsor, who happens to be a member of the Historical Society, bought a ticket for the event. When she got in, she pretended to be a conservative donor, attending the event with her husband. Ms. Windsor then approached some of the conservative justices and secretly recorded her conversations with them. NBC News has not heard the full tape of what was recorded, so we cannot say for certain where edits were made, if any were actually made. And tonight, we have some brand new, never before heard audio from that event to play for you. And when you hear these new tapes, you will hear something familiar to what was on the tapes released yesterday. A justice, in this case, Justice Alito, who is aggrieved and frustrated, who is nakedly partisan and totally unconcerned by appearing to be all of those things in front of a total stranger. Remember what we heard yesterday.
As a Catholic and as someone who really cherishes my faith, I don't know that we can negotiate with the left in the way that needs to happen for the polarization to end. I think that it's a matter of winning.
I think you're probably right. I mean, one side or the other is going to win. I don't know. I mean, there can be a way of living together peacefully, but it's difficult, because there are differences on fundamental things that really can't be compromised. It really can't be compromised. So it's not like we're going to split the difference.
And that's what I'm saying. I think that the solution really is winning the moral argument. People in this country who believe in God have got to keep fighting for that, to return our country to a place of godliness.
Oh, I agree with you.
Remember, at this closed-door cocktail party, Ms. Windsor was also able to get Justice Alito's wife, Martha Ann, to explain her deeply personal motivation for flying 2 insurrectionist flags in front of the Alito homes. That is a story that has just scandalized this court, and these recordings this week would seem to suggest that Mrs. Alito has no shame about what she has been doing here. In fact, quite the opposite. After deriding feminazis who have been critical of the scandal engulfing her husband, Martha Ann Alito made clear that these flags she flies are explicitly her form of resistance and response.
You know what I want? I want a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, because I have to look across the lagoon at the Pride flag for the next month.
Exactly.
And he's like, oh, please don't put up a flag. I said, I won't do it because I'm deferring to you. But when you are free of this nonsense, I'm putting it up, and I'm going to send them a message every day. Maybe every week I'll be changing the flags. There'll be all kinds. I made a flag in my head. This is how I satisfy myself. I made a flag. It's white, and it's yellow and orange flames around it, and in the middle is the word vergogna. Vergogna in Italian means shame.
Just to be clear here, Justice Alito has publicly stated that his wife did not fly these flags to associate herself with the Stop the Steal movement or any other group. But it seems quite clear from that clip that his wife very much sees these flags as a form of political expression and a response to what she believes are liberal attacks. Perhaps most concerning in these recordings, though, is Martha Ann Alito's 5-year plan for revenge.
It's okay, because if they come back to me, I'll get them. I'm going to be liberated, and I'm going to get them. What do you mean by... Oh, well, there's a 5-year defamation statute of limitations.
I don't know what you mean by gay, yeah.
Okay, so Martha Ann Alito, the wife of a Supreme Court justice, says she has a plan to get back at the media by suing for defamation. And she thinks she'll have the opportunity to do that in the next 5 years when she is free of all this nonsense. Is Sam Alito's wife telling us something here about Justice Alito's retirement plans? And how concerned should we all be that a Supreme Court justice's spouse is talking about the American media with open contempt? Well, tonight we have brand new audio from that same event where Justice Alito himself tells us what he thinks about the Fourth Estate, the press. The other voice you will hear on this tape is an associate of Lauren Windsor's who was also at this event.
And I just wanted to ask you, why do you think the Supreme Court is so
it's a simple reason they don't like our decisions, and they don't like how they anticipate we may decide some cases that are coming up. That's the beginning and the end of it. And there are groups that are very well funded by ideological gifts that have spearheaded these attempts. That's what it is.
Like who? Sorry.
Oh, ProPublica gets a lot of money, and they have spent a fortune investigating Clarence Thomas. Everything that he's ever done in his entire life. And they've done some of that to me too. But they look for any little thing they can find, and they try to make sense of it.
NBC News reached out for comment from both Samuel Alito and his wife, Martha Ann Alito, but we have not heard back. Joining me now is Lauren Windsor, progressive activist and the executive producer of The Undercurrent. Lauren, thank you for being here. I know you've had a busy week so far. We're so appreciative of all that you've said thus far and all that you have to share with us tonight. Let me just first start with the new sound that your organization or your colleague has given us. There are two parts of this new tape that strike me as concerning. The first is Justice Samuel Alito saying that the media is attacking him because the media doesn't like how they anticipate the court has decided cases and may decide upcoming cases. Was that a window into what may be coming down the pike in the next 2 weeks? How did you interpret that?
I mean, I definitely interpret it as being a harbinger for bad things to come.
Did you get the sense when he was talking about the media and then specifically citing ProPublica, for example, and their extensive investigative reporting about Clarence Thomas, that Alito is reading, that these stories are very much being shared behind closed doors at the Supreme Court? I mean, his media awareness seemed to be relatively high.
Oh, it's very high. And, he already had a sense of grievance when I first spoke with him in 2023. But it was much more pronounced this year, I think, in the two conversations that both Ali and I had with him.
Can we just talk about the context here? The fact is, you and your colleague both had conversations with the Alitos. For those of us who haven't been to Supreme Court Historical Society events, is this what happens? Is this what happens at them? Because we now have two kind of bombshell series of reports about conversations, advocacy campaigns that are happening between attendees and the justices on the Supreme Court.
Well, it's interesting. I had actually read that initial report in the New York Times about Reverend Schenck, and that's part of what played into my going in the first place. But, I didn't read that report and think I should become a member now. It really was incited by the ProPublica reporting on Clarence Thomas. And it's interesting that Justice Alito wants to rail about the money taken by ProPublica for investigating, public servants, while Clarence Thomas is not disclosing millions of dollars of gifts from GOP donors. And I have no idea what ProPublica's finances are, but as someone who is an independent journalist, I would imagine that the money that Clarence Thomas has taken probably rivals the budget of ProPublica in any given year.
Yeah, it's such a good point. What did you hear in Alito's sort of explanation for that? Did you hear, it almost seems as if there's certainly no contrition, but there's not even an acknowledgement that there was any wrongdoing on the part of Clarence Thomas in accepting potentially millions of dollars in unspecified gifts from conservative donors.
It's not verbatim, but it's almost verbatim, making something out of any little thing. I don't consider any little thing to be, buying my mother's house or paying for my nephew's tuition or getting a free RV loan. And these are all things that he's accepted from GOP donors. So it would be a much different story if this were just about vacations he was taking with Harlan Crow and his wife and Harlan Crow's family. I think most people would write it off as, oh, it was a trip. Most people would not consider, traveling with friends or associates as being something that's that big of a deal, but that's not actually what we're talking about with Clarence Thomas, is it?
No, it's another order of magnitude, it would seem, and it's been going on for years. I mean, I guess some part of me is surprised that you, not knowing the Alitos, you're just a random member of the Historical Society, is able to even get within, shoulder-rubbing distance of a justice and then draw him into conversation about some of the most incendiary topics in this country, which is the partisan divide. Can you talk, how did it actually unfold when you were in the room with the justice?
Well, so it should be stated that in the guidance for the event, the Historical Society says if you broach topics that are before the court, it may be grounds for you to be kicked out. And so there was definitely a deliberative process in how do I approach someone that, not only are judges supposed to be really the height of discretion, the height of judgment, right? This is the highest court in the land. This is a Supreme Court justice. So I definitely went into this assuming that I was not going to get anything newsworthy. In 2023, I did not get anything newsworthy. But I thought, throughout the year that transpired, the media scrutiny on Justice Alito has intensified so much, and his grievance level is probably so much more peaked that, unlike Clarence Thomas, who did not show up to this dinner, but has been reported to have shown up to it many times, and he didn't show up in 2023, by the way, that Justice Alito would probably attend anyway, even though he was undergoing this very intense media glare. And sure enough, he was there. And I think, it was just something that I can't say what was in his mind, so I don't know if in 2023 he had the same level of grievance and it changed over the course of the year.
Sure.
There's a couple options there. Did it change, or was it always there and he just felt more comfortable?
Was it hard to get him to talk? I mean, he did, at the very end of this conversation, he says, "Are you a lawyer?" I think he's talking to Allie, your colleague. I'm not sure if it's you or her. But it wasn't like you had offered any biographical information other than you had a husband who was not in the room. And I wonder why you offered that piece of information. Like, how did you actually get into conversation with him? Did you just go up to him and start talking to him?
Well, so the reason why I brought up my husband was that in 2023, I came with a male friend. So the context of it was we had a conversation after dinner. In 2023, my male friend was with me. He was not with me in 2024. So when I saw Justice Alito solo, it was one-on-one. It was, "Hi there, my husband really wants to let you know that we're rooting for you, that you really have all the grit." And the reason why I said you have all the grit, if it doesn't stick out to people, this was because Donald Trump had tweeted something out about how, there should be more justices like Samuel Alito with the grit that Samuel Alito has. And so I felt like it was kind of a flag, if you will, to Alito, that it was
a safe space for him.
A safe space, yes. I was trying to signal to him very coyly without saying Trump, because it goes back to the way to broach a conversation with someone who has the highest level of discretion. You can't talk about partisan politics. If I had walked up to him and started talking about Joe Biden or Donald Trump, he would have shut down. So talking about polarization was really a way into the conversation that wasn't as aggressive, but also indicative of what I was really trying to get at was, is he acting on bias? And I really do believe that the American people deserve to know, is the Supreme Court so compromised that we do not really have impartiality, the bedrock of our judicial system? I think hearing it from his mouth that he cannot be impartial, that there are things that cannot be compromised.
Yeah.
that needs to be fuel for journalists and for Congress to say, okay, well, tell us what are the things that can't be compromised.
Well, Lauren, look, you brought us into a room that few people are ever in, and I think these tapes are revelatory, and they are coming at a time of crisis for this court. It is, you know, we're not done having this conversation. Thank you for bringing some of that conversation to our air. We're really appreciative. Thanks for spending some time with me tonight, Lauren Windsor.
Thank you, Alex.